Chapter 15 and 16 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 15. End of the Yacht Adventure. We must now return to Nella Racksole and Prince Aribert of Posen on board the yacht without a name. The prince's first business was to make Jules, otherwise Mr. Tom Jackson, perfectly secure by means of several pieces of rope. Although Mr. Jackson had been stunned into complete unconsciousness, and there was a contused wound under his ear, no one could say how soon he might not come to himself and get very violent. So the prince, having tied his arms and legs, made him fast to a stanchion. "I hope he won't die," said Nella. "He looks very white." "The Mr. Jacksons of this world," said Prince Aribert sententiously, "never die till they're hung. By the way, I wonder how it is that no one has interfered with us. Perhaps they are discreetly afraid of my revolver. Of your revolver, I mean." Both he and Nella glanced up at the imperturbable steersman, who kept the yacht's head straight out to sea. By this time they were about a couple of miles from the Belgian shore. Addressing him in French, the prince ordered the sailor to put the yacht about and make again for Ostend harbour, but the fellow took no notice whatever of the summons. The prince raised the revolver with the idea of frightening the steersman, and then the men began to talk rapidly in a mixture of French and Flemish. He said that he had received Jules' strict orders not to interfere in any way, no matter what might happen on the deck of the yacht. He was the captain of the yacht, and he had to make for a certain English port, the name of which he could not divulge. He was to keep the vessel at full steam ahead under any and all circumstances. He seemed to be a very big, a very strong, and a very determined man, and the prince was at a loss what course of action to pursue. He asked several more questions, but the only effect of them was to render the man taciturn and ill-humoured. In vain Prince Aribert explained that Miss Nella Racksole, daughter of millionaire Racksole, had been abducted by Mr. Tom Jackson. In vain he flourished the revolver threateningly. The surly but courageous captain said merely that had nothing to do with him. He had instructions, and he should carry them out. He sarcastically begged to remind his interlocutor that he was the captain of the yacht. "It won't do to shoot him, I suppose," said the prince to Nella. "I might bore a hole into his leg, or something of that kind." "It's rather risky, and rather hard on the poor captain, with his extraordinary sense of duty," said Nella. "And besides, the whole crew might turn on us. No, we must think of something else." "I wonder where the crew is," said the prince. Just then Mr. Jackson, prone and bound on the deck, showed signs of recovering from his swoon. His eyes opened and he gazed vacantly around. At length he caught sight of the prince, who approached him with the revolver well in view. "It's you, is it?" he murmured faintly. "What are you doing on board? Who's tied me up like this?" "See here," replied the prince, "I don't want to have any arguments, but this yacht must return to Ostend at once, where you will be given up to the authorities." "Really?" snarled Mr. Tom Jackson. "Shall I?" Then he called out in French to the man at the wheel. "Hi, André! Let these two be put off in the dinghy." It was a peculiar situation. Certain of nothing but the possession of Nella's revolver, the prince scarcely knew whether to carry the argument further and with stronger measures, or to accept the situation with as much dignity as the circumstances would permit. "Let us take the dinghy," said Nella. "We can row ashore in an hour." He felt that she was right. To leave the yacht in such a manner seemed somewhat ignominious, and it certainly involved the escape of that profound villain, Mr. Thomas Jackson. But what else could be done? The prince and Nella constituted one party on the vessel. They knew their own strength, but they did not know the strength of their opponents. They held the hostile ringleader bound and captive, but this man had proved himself capable of giving orders, and even to gag him would not help them if the captain of the yacht persisted in his obstinate course. Moreover, there was a distinct objection to promiscuous shooting. The prince felt that. There was no knowing how promiscuous shooting might end. "We will take the dinghy," said the prince quickly, to the captain. A bell rang below, and a sailor and the negro boy appeared on deck. The pulsations of the screw grew less rapid. The yacht stopped. The dinghy was lowered. As the prince and Nella prepared to descend into the little cockboat, Mr. Tom Jackson addressed Nella, all bound as he lay. "Good-bye," he said. "I shall see you again, never fear." In another moment they were in the dinghy, and the dinghy was adrift. The yacht's screw churned the water, and the beautiful vessel slipped away from them. As it receded, a figure appeared at the stern. It was Mr. Thomas Jackson. He had been released by his minions. He held a white handkerchief to his ear, and offered a calm, enigmatic smile to the two forlorn but victorious occupants of the dinghy. Jules had been defeated for once in his life, or perhaps it would be more just to say that he had been outmaneuvered. Men like Jules are incapable of being defeated. It was characteristic of his luck that now, in the very hour when he had been caught red-handed in a serious crime against society, he should be effecting a leisurely escape, an escape which left no clue behind. The sea was utterly calm and blue in the morning sun. The dinghy rocked itself lazily in the swell of the yacht's departure. As the mist cleared away, the outline of the shore became more distinct, and it appeared as if Ostend was distant scarcely a cable's length. The white dome of the great Kursaal glittered in the pale turquoise sky, and the smoke of steamers in the harbour could be plainly distinguished. On the offing was a crowd of brown-sailed fishing luggers returning with the night's catch. The many-hued bathing vans could be counted on the distant beach. Everything seemed perfectly normal. It was difficult for either Nella or her companion to realize that anything extraordinary had happened within the last hour. Yet there was the yacht, not a mile off, to prove to them that something very extraordinary had in fact happened. The yacht was no vision, nor was that sinister watching figure at its stern a vision either. I suppose Jules was too surprised and too feeble to inquire how I came to be on board his yacht, said the Prince, taking the oars. Oh, how did you? Asked Nella, her face lighting up. Really, I'd almost forgotten that part of the affair. I must begin at the beginning, and it will take some time, answered the Prince. Had we not better postpone the recital till we get ashore? I will row and you shall talk, said Nella. I want to know now. He smiled happily at her, but gently declined to yield up the oars. Is it not sufficient that I am here? He said. It is sufficient, yes, she replied. But I want to know. With a long, easy stroke he was pulling the dinghy shorewards. She sat in the stern sheets. There is no rudder, he remarked, so you must direct me. Keep the boat's head on the lighthouse. The tide seems to be running in strongly. That will help us. The people on shore will think that we've only been for a little early morning excursion. Will you kindly tell me how it came about that you were able to save my life, Prince? She said. Save your life, Miss Racksole? I didn't save your life. I merely knocked a man down. You saved my life, she repeated. That villain would have stopped at nothing. I saw it in his eye. Then you were a brave woman, for you showed no fear of death. His admiring gaze rested full on her. For a moment the oars ceased to move. She gave a gesture of impatience. It happened that I saw you last night in your carriage, he said. The fact is, I had not had the audacity to go to Berlin with my story. I stopped in Ostend to see whether I could do a little detective work on my own account. It was a piece of good luck that I saw you. I followed the carriage as quickly as I could, and I just caught a glimpse of you as you entered that awful house. I knew that Jules had something to do with that house. I guessed what you were doing. I was afraid for you. Fortunately, I had surveyed the house pretty thoroughly. There is an entrance to it at the back, from a narrow lane. I made my way there. I got into the yard at the back, and I stood under the window of the room where you had the interview with Miss Spencer. I heard everything that was said. It was a courageous enterprise on your part to follow Miss Spencer from the Grand Babylon to Ostend. Well, I dared not force an entrance, lest I might precipitate matters too suddenly, and involve both of us in a difficulty. I merely kept watch. Ah, Miss Racksole, you were magnificent with Miss Spencer. As I say, I could hear every word, for the window was slightly open. I felt that you needed no assistance from me. And then she cheated you with a trick, and the revolver came flying through the window. I picked it up. I thought it would probably be useful. There was a silence. I did not guess at first that you had fainted. I thought that you had escaped. When I found out the truth, it was too late for me to intervene. There were two men, both desperate, besides Miss Spencer. Who was the other man? Asked Nella. I do not know. It was dark. They drove away with you to the harbour. Again I followed. I saw them carry you on board. Before the yacht weighed anchor, I managed to climb unobserved into the dinghy. I lay down full length in it, and no one suspected that I was there. I think you know the rest. Was the yacht all ready for sea? The yacht was all ready for sea. The captain fellow was on the bridge and steam was up. Then they expected me. How could that be? They expected someone. I do not think they expected you. Did the second man go on board? He helped to carry you along the gangway, but he came back again to the carriage. He was the driver. And no one else saw the business? The quay was deserted. You see, the last steamer had arrived for the night." There was a brief silence, and then Nella ejaculated under her breath, "Truly, it is a wonderful world." And it was a wonderful world for them, though scarcely perhaps in the sense which Nella Racksole had intended. They had just emerged from a highly disconcerting experience. Among other minor inconveniences, they had had no breakfast. They were out in the sea in a tiny boat. Neither of them knew what the day might bring forth. The man, at least, had the most serious anxieties for the safety of his royal nephew. And yet, neither of them wished that voyage of the little boat on the summer tide should come to an end. Each, perhaps unconsciously, had a vague desire that it might last for ever, he lazily pulling, she directing his course at intervals by a movement of her distractingly pretty head. How was this condition of affairs to be explained? Well, they were both young, they both had superb health, and all the ardour of youth, and they were together. The boat was very small indeed. Her face was scarcely a yard from his. She, in his eyes, surrounded by the glamour of beauty and vast wealth. He, in her eyes, surrounded by the glamour of masculine intrepidity and the brilliance of a throne. But all voyages come to an end, either at the shore or at the bottom of the sea, and at length the dinghy passed between the stone jetties of the harbour. The Prince rowed to the nearest steps, tied up the boat, and they landed. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and a day of gorgeous sunlight had opened. Few people were about at that early hour. "And now, what next?" said the Prince. "I must take you to a hotel." "I am in your hands," she acquiesced, with a smile which sent the blood racing through his veins. He perceived now that she was tired and overcome, suffering from a sudden and natural reaction. At the Hotel Wellington the Prince told the sleepy doorkeeper that they had come by the early train from Bruges, and wanted breakfast at once. It was absurdly early, but a common English sovereign will work wonders in any Belgian hotel, and in a very brief time Nella and the Prince were breakfasting on the veranda of the hotel upon chocolate that had been specially and hastily brewed for them. "I never tasted such excellent chocolate," claimed the Prince. The statement was wildly untrue, for the Hotel Wellington is not celebrated for its chocolate. Nevertheless, Nella replied enthusiastically, "Nor I." Then there was a silence, and Nella, feeling possibly that she had been too ecstatic, remarked in a very matter-of-fact tone, "I must telegraph to Papa instantly." Thus it was that Theodore Racksole received the telegram which drew him away from Detective Marshall. Chapter 16. The Woman with the Red Hat. "There's one thing, Prince, that we've just got to settle straight off," said Theodore Racksole. They were all three seated, Racksole, his daughter, and Prince Aribert, round a dinner table in a private room at the Hotel Wellington. Racksole had duly arrived by the afternoon boat, and had been met on the quay by the other two. They had dined early, and Racksole had heard the full story of the adventures by sea and land of Nella and the Prince. As to his own adventure of the previous night he said very little, merely explaining, with as little detail as possible, that Dimmock's body had come to light. "What is that?" asked the Prince, in answer to Racksole's remark. "We've got to settle whether we shall tell the police at once all that has occurred, or whether we shall proceed on our own responsibility. There can be no doubt as to which course we ought to pursue. Every consideration of prudence points to the advisability of taking the police into our confidence, and leaving the matter entirely in their hands." "Oh, Papa!" Nella burst out in her pouting, impulsive way. "You surely can't think of such a thing. Why, the fun has only just begun." "Do you call last night fun?" questioned Racksole, gazing at her solemnly. "Yes, I do," she said promptly. "Now?" "Well, I don't," was the millionaire's laconic response, but perhaps he was thinking of his own situation in the lift. "Do you not think we might investigate a little further?" said the Prince judiciously, as he cracked a walnut. "Just a little further, and then, if we fail to accomplish anything, there would still be ample opportunity to consult the police." "How do you suggest we should begin?" asked Racksole. "Well, there is the house which Miss Racksole so intrepidly entered last evening." He gave her the homage of an admiring glance. "You and I, Mr Racksole, might examine that abode in detail." "To night?" "Certainly. We might do something. We might do too much. For example? We might shoot someone or get ourselves mistaken for burglars. If we outstepped the law, it would be no excuse for us that we had been acting in a good cause. True, said the Prince. Nevertheless... He stopped. Nevertheless, you have a distaste for bringing the police into the business. You want the hunt all to yourself. You are on fire with the ardour of the chase. Is not that it? Accept the advice of an older man, Prince, and sleep on this affair. I have little fancy for nocturnal escapades 2 nights together. As for you, Nella, off with you to bed. The Prince and I will have a yarn over such fluids as can be obtained in this hole. Papa, she said, you're perfectly horrid tonight. Perhaps I am, he said. Decidedly, I am very cross with you for coming over here all alone. It was monstrous. If I didn't happen to be the most foolish of parents... There, good night. It's 9 o'clock. The Prince, I'm sure, will excuse you. If Nella had not really been very tired, Prince Aribert might have been the witness of a good-natured but stubborn conflict between the millionaire and his spirited offspring. As it was, Nella departed with surprising docility, and the 2 men were left alone. Now, said Racksole suddenly, changing his tone, I fancy that after all I am your man for a little amateur investigation tonight, and, if I must speak the exact truth, I think that to sleep on this affair would be about the very worst thing we could do. But I was anxious to keep Nella out of harm's way, at any rate till tomorrow. She is a very difficult creature to manage, Prince, and I may warn you," he laughed grimly, "that if we do succeed in doing anything tonight, we shall catch it from her ladyship in the morning. Are you ready to take that risk?" "I am," the Prince smiled, "but Miss Racksole is a young lady of quite remarkable nerve." "She is," said Racksole dryly. "I wish sometimes she had less." "I have the highest admiration for Miss Racksole," said the Prince, and he looked Miss Racksole's father full in the face. "You honour us, Prince," Racksole observed. "Let us come to business. Am I right in assuming that you have a reason for keeping the police out of this business, if it can possibly be done?" "Yes," said the Prince, and his brow clouded. "I am very much afraid that my poor nephew has involved himself in some scrape that he would wish not to be divulged." "Then you do not believe that he is the victim of foul play?" "I do not." "And the reason, if I may ask it?" "Mr Racksole, we speak in confidence, is it not so? Some years ago my foolish nephew had an affair with a feminine star of the Berlin stage. For anything I know, the lady may have been the very pattern of her sex, but where a reigning prince is concerned, scandal cannot be avoided in such a matter. I had thought that the affair was quite at an end, since my nephew's betrothal to Princess Anna of Eckstein Schwarzburg is shortly to be announced. But yesterday I saw the lady to whom I have referred driving on the Digue. The coincidence of her presence here with my nephew's disappearance is too extraordinary to be disregarded." "But how does this theory square with the murder of Reginald Dimmock?" "It does not square with it. My idea is that the murder of poor Dimmock and the disappearance of my nephew are entirely unconnected. Unless, indeed, this Berlin actress is playing into the hands of the murderers. I had not thought of that." "Then what do you propose to do tonight?" "I propose to enter the house which Miss Racksole entered last night, and to find out something definite." "I concur," said Racksole. "I shall heartily enjoy it. But let me tell you, Prince, and pardon me for speaking bluntly, your surmise is incorrect. I would wager 100,000 pounds that Prince Eugen has been kidnapped." "What grounds have you for being so sure?" "Ah," said Racksole, "that's a long story. Let me begin by asking you this. Are you aware that your nephew, Prince Eugen, owes 1 million of money?" "1 million of money!" cried Prince Aribert astonished. "It is impossible." "Nevertheless he does," said Racksole calmly. Then he told him all he had learned from Mr Sampson Levi. "What have you to say to that?" Racksole ended. Prince Aribert made no reply. "What have you to say to that?" Racksole insisted. "Merely that Eugen is ruined, even if he is alive." "Not at all," Racksole returned with cheerfulness. "Not at all. We shall see about that. The special thing that I want to know just now from you is this. Has any previous application ever been made for the hand of the Princess Anna?" "Yes, last year. The King of Bosnia sued for it, but his proposal was declined. Why? Because my nephew was considered to be a more suitable match for her. Not because the personal character of His Majesty of Bosnia is scarcely of the brightest. No. Unfortunately, it is usually impossible to consider questions of personal character when a royal match is concerned. Then, if for any reason the marriage of Princess Anna with your nephew was frustrated, the King of Bosnia would have a fair chance in that quarter. He would. The political aspect of things would be perfectly satisfactory. Thanks, said Racksole. I will wager another $100,000 that someone in Bosnia, I don't accuse the king himself, is at the bottom of this business. The methods of Balkan politicians have always been half oriental. Let us go. Where? To this precious house of Nella's adventure. But surely it is too early. So it is, said Racksole, and we shall want a few things too. For instance, a dark lantern. I think I will go out and forage for a lantern. And a revolver, suggested Prince Aribert. Does it mean revolvers? The millionaire laughed. It may come to that. Here you are then, my friend, said Racksole, and he pulled one out of his hip pocket. And yours? I, said the Prince, I have your daughter's. The deuce you have, murmured Racksole to himself. It was then 9:30. They decided that it would be impolitic to begin their operations till after midnight. There were 3 hours to spare. Let us go and see the gambling, Racksole suggested. We might encounter the Berlin lady. The suggestion, in the first instance, was not made seriously, but it appeared to both men that they might do worse than spend the intervening time in the gorgeous saloon of the Kursaal, where, in the season, as much money is won and lost as at Monte Carlo. It was striking 10 o'clock as they entered the rooms. There was a large company present, a company which included some of the most notorious persons in Europe. In that multifarious assemblage all were equal. The electric light shone coldly and impartially on the just and on the unjust, on the fool and the knave, on the European and the Asiatic. As usual, women monopolized the best places at the tables. The scene was familiar enough to Prince Aribert, who had witnessed it frequently at Monaco, but Theodore Racksole had never before entered any European gaming palace. He had only the haziest idea of the rules of play, and he was at once interested. For some time they watched the play at the table which happened to be nearest to them. Racksole never moved his lips. With his eyes glued on the table, and ears open for every remark of the players and the croupier, he took his first lesson in roulette. He saw a mere youth win 15,000 francs, which were stolen in the most barefaced manner by a rouged girl scarcely older than the youth. He saw 2 old gamesters stake their coins and lose and walk quietly out of the place. He saw the bank win 50,000 francs at a single turn. This is rather good fun, he said at length, but the stakes are too small to make it really exciting. I'll try my luck, just for the experience. I'm bound to win. Why? Asked the Prince. Because I always do, in games of chance, Racksole answered with gay confidence. It is my fate. Then, tonight, you must remember, I shall be a beginner, and you know the tyro's luck. In 10 minutes the croupier of that table was obliged to suspend operations pending the arrival of a further supply of coin. What did I tell you? Said Racksole, leading the way to another table further up the room. 100 curious glances went after him. One old woman, whose gay attire suggested a false youthfulness, begged him in French to stake a 5-franc piece for her. She offered him the coin. He took it and gave her a 100-franc note in exchange. She clutched the crisp rustling paper and with hysterical haste scuttled back to her own table. At the second table there was a considerable air of excitement. In the forefront of the players was a woman in a low-cut evening dress of black silk and a large red picture hat. Her age appeared to be about 28. She had dark eyes, full lips, and a distinctly Jewish nose. She was handsome, but her beauty was of that forbidding, sinister order which is often called Junoesque. This woman was the centre of attraction. People said to each other that she had won 160,000 francs that day at the table. "You're right," Prince Aribert whispered to Theodore Racksole. "That is the Berlin lady." "The deuce she is! Has she seen you? Will she know you?" "She would probably know me, but she hasn't looked up yet." "Keep behind her, then. I propose to find her a little occupation." By dint of a carefully exercised diplomacy, Racksole manoeuvred himself into a seat opposite to the lady in the red hat. The fame of his success at the other table had followed him, and people regarded him as a serious and formidable player. In the first turn the lady put 1,000 francs on 00. Racksole put 100 on number 19 and 1,000 on the odd numbers. 19 won. Racksole received 4,400 francs. 9 times in succession Racksole backed number 19 in the odd numbers. 9 times the lady backed 00. 9 times Racksole won and the lady lost. The other players, perceiving that the affair had resolved itself into a duel, stood back for the most part and watched those two. Prince Aribert never stirred from his position behind the great red head. The game continued. Racksole lost trifles from time to time, but 99/100ths of the luck was with him. As an English spectator at the table remarked, he couldn't do wrong. When midnight struck, the lady in the red hat was reduced to 1,000 francs. Then she fell into a winning vein for half an hour. But at 1 o'clock her resources were exhausted. Of the 160,000 francs which she was reputed to have had early in the evening, Racksole held about 90,000, and the bank had the rest. It was a calamity for the Juno of the red hat. She jumped up, stamped her foot, and hurried from the room. At a discreet distance Racksole and the Prince pursued her. It might be well to ascertain her movements, said Racksole. Outside, in the glare of the great arc lights, and within sound of the surf which beats always at the very foot of the Kursaal, the Juno of the red hat summoned a fiacre and drove rapidly away. Racksole and the Prince took an open carriage and started in pursuit. They had not, however, travelled more than half a mile when Prince Aribert stopped the carriage and, bidding Racksole get out, paid the driver and dismissed him. "I feel sure I know where she's going," he explained, "and it would be better for us to follow on foot." "You mean she's making for the scene of the last night's affair?" said Racksole. "Exactly. We shall, what you call, kill 2 birds with 1 stone." Prince Aribert's guess was correct. The lady's carriage stopped in front of the house where Nella Racksole and Miss Spencer had had their interview on the previous evening, and the lady vanished into the building just as the 2 men appeared at the end of the street. Instead of proceeding along that street, the Prince led Racksole to the lane which gave on to the backs of the houses, and he counted the houses as they went up the lane. In a few minutes they had burglariously climbed over a wall, and crept, with infinite caution, up a long narrow piece of ground, half garden, half paved yard, till they crouched under a window which was shielded by curtains, but which had been left open a little. "Listen," said the Prince in his lightest whisper. "They're talking." "Who?" "The Berlin lady and Miss Spencer. I'm sure it's Miss Spencer's voice." Racksole boldly pushed the French window a little wider open, and put his ear to the aperture, through which came a beam of yellow light. "Take my place," he whispered to the Prince. "They're talking German. You'll understand better." Silently they exchanged places under the window, and the Prince listened intently. "Then you refuse?" Miss Spencer's visitor was saying. There was no answer from Miss Spencer. "Not even 1,000 francs? I tell you, I've lost the whole 25,000." Again no answer. "Then I'll tell the whole story," the lady went on, in an angry rush of words. "I did what I promised to do. I enticed him here, and you've got him safe in your vile cellar, poor little man, and you won't give me a paltry 1,000 francs?" "You've already had your price." The words were Miss Spencer's. They fell cold and calm on the night air. "I want another 1,000." "I haven't it." "Then we'll see." Prince Aribert heard a rustle of flying skirts, then another movement, a door banged, and the beam of light through the aperture of the window suddenly disappeared. He pushed the window wide open. The room was in darkness and apparently empty. "Now that lantern of yours," he said eagerly to Theodore Racksole, after he had translated to him the conversation of the 2 women. Racksole produced the dark lantern from the capacious pocket of his dust coat and lighted it. The ray flashed about the ground. "What is it?" exclaimed Prince Aribert with a swift cry, pointing to the ground. The lantern threw its light on a perpendicular grating at their feet, through which could be discerned a cellar. They both knelt down and peered into the subterranean chamber. On a broken chair a young man sat listlessly with closed eyes, his head leaning heavily forward on his chest. In the feeble light of the lantern he had the livid and ghastly appearance of a corpse. "Who can it be?" said Racksole. "It is Eugen," was the Prince's low answer. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 and 18 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 17. The Release of Prince Eugen. Eugen! Prince Aribert called softly. At the sound of his own name, the young man in the cellar feebly raised his head and stared up at the grating which separated him from his two rescuers. But his features showed no recognition. He gazed in an aimless, vague, silly manner for a few seconds, his eyes blinking under the glare of the lantern, and then his head slowly drooped again onto his chest. He was dressed in a dark tweed travelling suit, and Racksole observed that one sleeve, the left, was torn across the upper part of the cuff, and that there were stains of dirt on the left shoulder. A soiled linen collar, which had lost all its starch and was half unbuttoned, partially encircled the captive's neck. His brown boots were unlaced. A cap, a handkerchief, a portion of a watch chain, and a few gold coins lay on the floor. Racksole flashed the lantern into the corners of the cellar, but he could discover no other furniture except the chair on which the hereditary Prince of Posen sat, and a small deal table on which were a plate and a cup. "Eugen!" cried Prince Aribert once more. But this time his forlorn nephew made no response whatever, and then Aribert added in a low voice to Racksole: "Perhaps he cannot see us clearly." "But he must surely recognize your voice," said Racksole, in a hard, gloomy tone. There was a pause, and the two men above ground looked at each other hesitatingly. Each knew that they must enter that cellar and get Prince Eugen out of it, and each was somehow afraid to take the next step. "Thank God he is not dead," said Aribert. "He may be worse than dead," Racksole replied. "Worse than? What do you mean?" "I mean, he may be mad." "Come!" Aribert almost shouted, with a sudden access of energy, a wild impulse for action, and, snatching the lantern from Racksole, he rushed into the dark room where they had heard the conversation of Miss Spencer and the lady in the red hat. For a moment Racksole did not stir from the threshold of the window. "Come!" Prince Aribert repeated, and there was an imperious command in his utterance. "What are you afraid of?" "I don't know," said Racksole, feeling stupid and queer. "I don't know." Then he marched heavily after Prince Aribert into the room. On the mantelpiece were a couple of candles which had been blown out, and in a mechanical, unthinking way Racksole lighted them, and the two men glanced round the room. It presented no peculiar features, it was just an ordinary room, rather small, rather mean, rather shabby, with an ugly wallpaper and ugly pictures in ugly frames. Thrown over a chair was a man's evening dress jacket. The door was closed. Prince Aribert turned the knob, but he could not open it. "It's locked," he said. "Evidently they know we're here." "Nonsense," said Racksole brusquely. "How can they know?" And taking hold of the knob he violently shook the door, and it opened. "I told you it wasn't locked," he added, and this small success of opening the door seemed to steady the man. It was a curious psychological effect, this terrorizing, for it amounted to that, of two courageous full grown men by the mere apparition of a helpless creature in a cellar. Gradually they both recovered from it. The next moment they were out in the passage which led to the front door of the house. The front door stood open. They looked into the street, up and down, but there was not a soul in sight. The street, lighted by 3 gas lamps only, seemed strangely sinister and mysterious. "She's gone, that's clear," said Racksole, meaning the woman with the red hat. "And Miss Spencer after her, do you think?" questioned Aribert. "No, she would stay. She would never dare to leave. Let us find the cellar steps." The cellar steps were happily not difficult to discover, for in moving a pace backwards Prince Aribert had a narrow escape of precipitating himself to the bottom of them. The lantern showed that they were built on a curve. Silently Racksole resumed possession of the lantern and went first, the Prince close behind him. At the foot was a short passage, and in this passage crouched the figure of a woman. Her eyes threw back the rays of the lantern, shining like a cat's at midnight. Then, as the men went nearer, they saw that it was Miss Spencer who barred their way. She seemed half to kneel on the stone floor, and in one hand she held what at first appeared to be a dagger, but which proved to be nothing more romantic than a rather long bread knife. "I heard you! I heard you!" she exclaimed. "Get back! You mustn't come here!" There was a desperate and dangerous look on her face, and her form shook with scarcely controlled passionate energy. "Now see here, Miss Spencer," Racksole said calmly. "I guess we've had enough of this fandango. You'd better get up and clear out, or we'll just have to drag you off." He went calmly up to her, the lantern in his hand. Without another word she struck the knife into his arm, and the lantern fell extinguished. Racksole gave a cry, rather of angry surprise than of pain, and retreated a few steps. In the darkness they could still perceive the glint of her eyes. "I told you you mustn't come here," the woman said. "Now get back." Racksole positively laughed. It was a queer laugh, but he laughed, and he could not help it. The idea of this woman, this bureau clerk, stopping his progress and that of Prince Aribert by means of a bread knife aroused his sense of humour. He struck a match, relighted the candle, and faced Miss Spencer once more. "I'll do it again," she said, with a note of hard resolve. "Oh, no, you won't, my girl," said Racksole, and he pulled out his revolver, cocked it, raised his hand. "Put down that plaything of yours," he said firmly. "No," she answered. "I shall shoot." She pressed her lips together. "I shall shoot," he repeated. 1, 2, 3. Bang, bang. He had fired twice, purposely missing her. Miss Spencer never blenched. Racksole was tremendously surprised, and he would have been 1,000-fold more surprised could he have contrasted her behaviour now with her abject terror on the previous evening when Nella had threatened her. "You've got a bit of pluck," he said, "but it won't help you. Why won't you let us pass?" As a matter of fact, pluck was just what she had not, really. She had merely subordinated one terror to another. She was desperately afraid of Racksole's revolver, but she was much more afraid of something else. "Why won't you let us pass?" "I daren't," she said, with a plaintive tremor. "Tom put me in charge." That was all. The man could see tears running down her poor wrinkled face. Theodore Racksole began to take off his light overcoat. "I see I must take my coat off to you," he said, and he almost smiled. Then, with a quick movement, he threw the coat over Miss Spencer's head and flew at her, seizing both her arms, while Prince Aribert assisted. Her struggles ceased. She was beaten. "That's all right," said Racksole. "I could never have used that revolver, to mean business with, of course." They carried her, unresisting, upstairs, and on to the upper floor, where they locked her in a bedroom. She lay in the bed as if exhausted. "Now for my poor Eugen," said Prince Aribert. "Don't you think we'd better search the house first?" Racksole suggested. "It will be safer to know just how we stand. We can't afford any ambushes or things of that kind, you know." The Prince agreed, and they searched the house from top to bottom, but found no one. Then, having locked the front door and the French window of the sitting room, they proceeded again to the cellar. Here a new obstacle confronted them. The cellar door was, of course, locked. There was no sign of a key, and it appeared to be a heavy door. They were compelled to return to the bedroom where Miss Spencer was incarcerated, in order to demand the key of the cellar from her. She still lay without movement on the bed. "Tom's got it," she replied, faintly, to their question. "Tom's got it, I swear to you. He took it for safety." "Then how do you feed your prisoner?" Racksole asked sharply. "Through the grating," she answered. Both men shuddered. They felt she was speaking the truth. For the third time they went to the cellar door. In vain Racksole thrust himself against it. He could do no more than shake it. "Let's try both together," said Prince Aribert. "Now!" There was a crack. "Again," said Prince Aribert. There was another crack, and then the upper hinge gave away. The rest was easy. Over the wreck of the door they entered Prince Eugen's prison. The captive still sat on his chair. The terrific noise and bustle of breaking down the door seemed not to have aroused him from his lethargy, but when Prince Aribert spoke to him in German he looked at his uncle. "Will you not come with us, Eugen?" said Prince Aribert. "You needn't stay here any longer, you know." "Leave me alone," was the strange reply. "Leave me alone. What do you want?" "We are here to get you out of this scrape," said Aribert gently. Racksole stood aside. "Who's that fellow?" said Eugen sharply. "That is my friend Mr Racksole, an Englishman, or rather, I should say, an American, to whom we owe a great deal. Come and have supper, Eugen." "I won't," answered Eugen doggedly. "I'm waiting here for her. You didn't think anyone had kept me here, did you, against my will? I tell you I'm waiting for her. She said she'd come." "Who is she?" Aribert asked, humouring him. She? Why, you know. I forgot, of course. You don't know. You mustn't ask. Don't pry, Uncle Aribert. She was wearing a red hat. I'll take you to her, my dear Eugen. Prince Aribert put his hands on the other's shoulder, but Eugen shook him off violently, stood up, and then sat down again. Aribert looked at Racksole, and they both looked at Prince Eugen. The latter's face was flushed, and Racksole observed that the left pupil was more dilated than the right. The men started, muttered odd, fragmentary scraps of sentences, now grumbling, now whining. "His mind is unhinged," Racksole whispered in English. "Hush!" said Prince Aribert. "He understands English." But Prince Eugen took no notice of the brief colloquy. "We'd better get him upstairs, somehow," said Racksole. "Yes," Aribert assented. "Eugen, the lady with the red hat, the lady you are waiting for, is upstairs. She has sent us down to ask you to come up. Won't you come?" "Himmel!" the poor fellow exclaimed, with a kind of weak anger. "Why did you not say this before?" He rose, staggered towards Aribert, and fell headlong on the floor. He had swooned. The two men raised him, carried him up the stone steps, and laid him with infinite care on a sofa. He lay, breathing queerly through the nostrils, his eyes closed, his fingers contracted. Every now and then a convulsion ran through his frame. "One of us must fetch a doctor," said Prince Aribert. "I will," said Racksole. At that moment there was a quick, curt rap on the French window, and both Racksole and the Prince glanced round startled. A girl's face was pressed against the large window pane. It was Nella's. Racksole unfastened the catch, and she entered. "I have found you," she said lightly. "You might have told me. I couldn't sleep. I inquired from the hotel folks if you had retired, and they said no, so I slipped out. I guessed where you were." Racksole interrupted her with a question as to what she meant by this escapade, but she stopped him with a careless gesture. "What's this?" She pointed to the form on the sofa. "That is my nephew, Prince Eugen," said Aribert. "Hurt?" she inquired coldly. "I hope not." "He is ill," said Racksole. "His brain is turned." Nella began to examine the unconscious Prince with the expert movements of a girl who had passed through the best hospital course to be obtained in New York. "He has got brain fever," she said. "That is all, but it will be enough. Do you know if there is a bed anywhere in this remarkable house?" Chapter 18. In the Night Time. "He must on no account be moved," said the dark little Belgian doctor, whose eyes seemed to peer so quizzically through his spectacles, and he said it with much positiveness. That pronouncement rather settled their plans for them. It was certainly a professional triumph for Nella, who, previous to the doctor's arrival, had told them the very same thing. Considerable argument had passed before the doctor was sent for. Prince Aribert was for keeping the whole affair a deep secret among their three selves. Theodore Racksole agreed so far, but he suggested further that at no matter what risk they should transport the patient over to England at once. Racksole had an idea that he should feel safer in that hotel of his, and better able to deal with any situation that might arise. Nella scorned the idea. In her quality of an amateur nurse she assured them that Prince Eugen was much more seriously ill than either of them suspected, and she urged that they should take absolute possession of the house, and keep possession till Prince Eugen was convalescent. "But what about the Spencer female?" Racksole had said. "Keep her where she is. Keep her a prisoner, and hold the house against all comers. If Jules should come back, simply defy him to enter, that is all. There are two of you, so you must keep an eye on the former occupiers if they return, and on Miss Spencer, while I nurse the patient. But first you must send for a doctor." "Doctor?" Prince Aribert had said, alarmed. "Will it not be necessary to make some awkward explanation to the doctor?" "Not at all," she replied. "Why should it be? In a place like Ostend doctors are far too discreet to ask questions. They see too much to retain their curiosity. Besides, do you want your nephew to die?" Both the men were somewhat taken aback by the girl's sagacious grasp of the situation, and it came about that they began to obey her like subordinates. She told her father to sally forth in search of a doctor, and he went. She gave Prince Aribert certain other orders, and he promptly executed them. By the evening of the following day everything was going smoothly. The doctor came and departed several times, and sent medicine, and seemed fairly optimistic as to the issue of the illness. An old woman had been induced to come in and cook and clean. Miss Spencer was kept out of sight on the attic floor, pending some decision as to what to do with her, and no one outside the house had asked any questions. The inhabitants of that particular street must have been accustomed to strange behaviour on the part of their neighbours, unaccountable appearances and disappearances, strange flittings and arrivals. This strong-minded and active trio, Racksole, Nella, and Prince Aribert, might have been the lawful and accustomed tenants of the house, for any outward evidence to the contrary. On the afternoon of the third day Prince Eugen was distinctly and seriously worse. Nella had sat up with him the previous night and throughout the day. Her father had spent the morning at the hotel, and Prince Aribert had kept watch. The two men were never absent from the house at the same time, and one of them always did duty as sentinel at night. On this afternoon Prince Aribert and Nella sat together in the patient's bedroom. The doctor had just left. Theodore Racksole was downstairs reading the New York Herald. The Prince and Nella were near the window, which looked on to the back garden. It was a queer, shabby little bedroom to shelter the august body of a European personage like Prince Eugen of Posen. Curiously enough, both Nella and her father, ardent democrats though they were, had been somehow impressed by the royalty and importance of the fever-stricken prince, impressed as they had never been by Aribert. They had both felt that here, under their care, was a species of individuality quite new to them, and different from anything they had previously encountered. Even the gestures and tones of his delirium had an air of abrupt yet condescending command, an imposing mixture of suavity and haughtiness. As for Nella, she had been first struck by the beautiful E over a crown on the sleeves of his linen, and by the signet ring on his pale, emaciated hand. After all, these trifling outward signs are at least as effective as others of deeper but less obtrusive significance. The Racksoles, too, duly marked the attitude of Prince Aribert to his nephew. It was at once paternal and reverential. It disclosed clearly that Prince Aribert continued, in spite of everything, to regard his nephew as his sovereign lord and master, as a being surrounded by a natural and inevitable pomp and awe. This attitude, at the beginning, seemed false and unreal to the Americans. It seemed to them to be assumed, but gradually they came to perceive that they were mistaken, and that though America might have cast out the monarchical superstition, nevertheless that superstition had vigorously survived in another part of the world. "You and Mr Racksole have been extraordinarily kind to me," said Prince Aribert very quietly, after the two had sat some time in silence. "Why? How?" she asked unaffectedly. "We are interested in this affair ourselves, you know. It began at our hotel. You mustn't forget that, Prince." "I don't," he said. "I forget nothing. But I cannot help feeling that I have led you into a strange entanglement. Why should you and Mr Racksole be here? You who are supposed to be on a holiday. Hiding in a strange house in a foreign country, subject to all sorts of annoyances and all sorts of risks, simply because I am anxious to avoid scandal, to avoid any sort of talk in connection with my misguided nephew. It is nothing to you that the hereditary Prince of Posen should be liable to a public disgrace. What will it matter to you if the throne of Posen becomes the laughing stock of Europe?" "I really don't know, Prince," Nella smiled roguishly. "But we Americans have a habit of going right through with anything we've begun." "Ah," he said, "who knows how this thing will end? All our trouble, our anxieties, our watchfulness may come to nothing. I tell you that when I see Eugen lying there, and think that we cannot learn his story until he recovers, I am ready to go mad. We might be arranging things, making matters smooth, preparing for the future, if only we knew what he can tell us. I tell you that I am ready to go mad. If anything should happen to you, Miss Racksole, I would kill myself." "But why?" she questioned. "Supposing, that is, that anything could happen to me, which it can't." "Because I have dragged you into this," he replied, gazing at her. "It is nothing to you. You are only being kind." "How do you know it is nothing to me, Prince?" she asked him quickly. Just then the sick man made a convulsive movement, and Nella flew to the bed and soothed him. From the head of the bed she looked over at Prince Aribert, and he returned her bright, excited glance. She was in her travelling frock, with a large white Belgian apron tied over it. Large dark circles of fatigue and sleeplessness surrounded her eyes, and to the Prince her cheeks seemed hollow and thin. Her hair lay thick over the temples, half covering the ears. Aribert gave no answer to her query, merely gazed at her with melancholy intensity. "I think I will go and rest," she said at last. "You will know all about the medicine. "Sleep well," he said, as he softly opened the door for her. And then he was alone with Eugen. It was his turn that night to watch, for they still half expected some strange, sudden visit, or onslaught, or move of one kind or another from Jules. Racksole slept in the parlour on the ground floor. Nella had the front bedroom on the first floor. Miss Spencer was immured in the attic. The last named lady had been singularly quiet and incurious, taking her food from Nella and asking no questions. The old woman went at nights to her own abode in the purlieus of the harbour. Hour after hour Aribert sat silent by his nephew's bedside, attending mechanically to his wants, and every now and then gazing hard into the vacant, anguished face, as if trying to extort from that mask the secrets which it held. Aribert was tortured by the idea that if he could have only half an hour's, only a quarter of an hour's rational speech with Prince Eugen, all might be cleared up and put right, and by the fact that that rational talk was absolutely impossible on Eugen's part until the fever had run its course. As the minutes crept on to midnight, the watcher, made nervous by the intense, electrical atmosphere which seems always to surround a person who is dangerously ill, grew more and more a prey to vague and terrible apprehensions. His mind dwelt hysterically on the most fatal possibilities. He wondered what would occur if by any ill chance Eugen should die in that bed. How he would explain the affair to Posen and to the Emperor, how he would justify himself. He saw himself being tried for murder, sentenced. Him, a prince of the blood. Led to the scaffold, a scene unparalleled in Europe for over a century. Then he gazed anew at the sick man, and thought he saw death in every drawn feature of that agonized face. He could have screamed aloud. His ears heard a peculiar resonant boom. He started. It was nothing but the city clock striking 12. But there was another sound, a mysterious shuffle at the door. He listened, then jumped from his chair. Nothing now, nothing. But still he felt drawn to the door, and after what seemed an interminable interval he went and opened it, his heart beating furiously. Nella lay in a heap on the doormat. She was fully dressed, but had apparently lost consciousness. He clutched at her slender body, picked her up, carried her to the chair by the fireplace, and laid her in it. He had forgotten all about Eugen. "What is it, my angel?" he whispered. And then he kissed her twice. He could only look at her. He did not know what to do to succour her. At last she opened her eyes and sighed. "Where am I?" she asked vaguely, in a tremulous tone, as she recognized him. "Is it you? Did I do anything silly? Did I faint?" "What has happened? Were you ill?" he questioned anxiously. He was kneeling at her feet, holding her hand tight. "I saw Jules by the side of my bed," she murmured. "I am sure I saw him. He laughed at me. I had not undressed. I sprang up, frightened, but he had gone, and then I ran downstairs to you." "You were dreaming," he soothed her. "Was I?" "You must have been. I have not heard a sound. No one could have entered. But if you like I will wake Mr Racksole." "Perhaps I was dreaming," she admitted. "How foolish!" "You were overtired," he said, still unconsciously holding her hand. They gazed at each other. She smiled at him. "You kissed me," she said suddenly, and he blushed red, and stood up before her. "Why did you kiss me?" "Ah, Miss Racksole," he murmured, hurrying the words out. "Forgive me. It is unforgivable, but forgive me. I was overpowered by my feelings. I did not know what I was doing." "Why did you kiss me?" she repeated. "Because, Nella, I love you. I have no right to say it." "Why have you no right to say it?" "If Eugen dies, I shall owe a duty to Posen. I shall be its ruler." "Well," she said calmly, with an adorable confidence, "Papa is worth 40 millions. Would you not abdicate?" "Ah!" he gave a low cry. "Will you force me to say these things? I could not shirk my duty to Posen, and the reigning Prince of Posen can only marry a princess." "But Prince Eugen will live," she said positively, "and if he lives—" "Then I shall be free. I would renounce all my rights to make you mine, if... "If what, Prince?" "If you would deign to accept my hand." "Am I, then, rich enough?" "Nella!" He bent down to her. Then there was a crash of breaking glass. Aribert went to the window and opened it. In the starlit gloom he could see that a ladder had been raised against the back of the house. He thought he heard footsteps at the end of the garden. "It was Jules!" he exclaimed to Nella, and without another word rushed upstairs to the attic. The attic was empty. Miss Spencer had mysteriously vanished. End of chapter 17 and 18. Chapter 19 and 20 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 19. Royalty at the Grand Babylon. The royal apartments at the Grand Babylon are famous in the world of hotels, and indeed elsewhere, as being, in their own way, unsurpassed. Some of the palaces of Germany, and in particular those of the mad Ludwig of Bavaria, may possess rooms and saloons which outshine them in gorgeous luxury and the mere wild fairy-like extravagance of wealth, but there is nothing, anywhere, even on 8th Avenue, New York, which can fairly be called more complete, more perfect, more enticing, or, not least important, more comfortable. The suite consists of 6 chambers: the ante-room, the saloon or audience chamber, the dining room, the yellow drawing room, where royalty receives its friends, the library, and the state bedroom, to the last of which we have already been introduced. The most important and most impressive of these is, of course, the audience chamber, an apartment 50 feet long by 40 feet broad, with a superb outlook over the Thames, the shot tower, and the higher signals of the South Western Railway. The decoration of this room is mainly in the German taste, since 4 out of every 6 of its royal occupants are of Teutonic blood. But its chief glory is its French ceiling, a masterpiece by Fragonard, taken bodily from a certain famous palace on the Loire. The walls are of panelled oak, with an 8-foot dado of Arras cloth imitated from unique continental examples. The carpet, woven in one piece, is an antique specimen of the finest Turkish work, and it was obtained, a bargain, by Felix Babylon from an impecunious Roumanian prince. The silver candelabra, now fitted with electric light, came from the Rhine, and each had a separate history. The royal chair (it is not etiquette to call it a throne, though it amounts to a throne) was looted by Napoleon from an Austrian city, and bought by Felix Babylon at the sale of a French collector. At each corner of the room stands a gigantic grotesque vase of German faience of the 16th century. These were presented to Felix Babylon by William I of Germany, upon the conclusion of his first incognito visit to London in connection with the French trouble of 1875. There is only one picture in the audience chamber. It is a portrait of the luckless but noble Dom Pedro, Emperor of the Brazils. Given to Felix Babylon by Dom Pedro himself, it hangs there solitary and sublime as a reminder to kings and princes that empires may pass away and greatness fall. A certain prince who was occupying the suite during the Jubilee of 1887, when the Grand Babylon had 7 persons of royal blood under its roof, sent a curt message to Felix that the portrait must be removed. Felix respectfully declined to remove it, and the prince left for another hotel, where he was robbed of £2,000 worth of jewellery. The royal audience chamber of the Grand Babylon, if people only knew it, is one of the sights of London, but it is never shown, and if you ask the hotel servants about its wonders, they will tell you only foolish facts concerning it, as that the Turkey carpet costs £50 to clean, and that one of the great vases is cracked across the pedestal, owing to the rough treatment accorded to it during a riotous game of blindman's buff, played one night by 4 young princesses, a Balkan king and his aide-de-camp. In one of the window recesses of this magnificent apartment, on a certain afternoon in late July, stood Prince Aribert of Posen. He was faultlessly dressed in the conventional frock-coat of English civilization, with a gardenia in his buttonhole, and the indispensable crease down the front of the trousers. He seemed to be fairly amused, and also to expect someone, for at frequent intervals he looked rapidly over his shoulder in the direction of the door behind the royal chair. At last a little, wizened, stooping old man, with a distinctly German cast of countenance, appeared through the door, and laid some papers on a small table by the side of the chair. "Ah, Hans, my old friend," said Aribert, approaching the old man, "I must have a little talk with you about 1 or 2 matters. How do you find his Royal Highness?" The old man saluted, military fashion. "Not very well, your Highness," he answered. I have been valet to your Highness's nephew since his majority, and I was valet to his royal father before him, but I never saw—" He stopped, and threw up his wrinkled hands deprecatingly. "You never saw what?" Aribert smiled affectionately on the old fellow. You could perceive that these two, so sharply differentiated in rank, had been intimate in the past, and would be intimate again. "Do you know, my prince," said the old man, "that we are to receive the financier, Sampson Levi, is that his name, in the audience chamber? Surely, if I may humbly suggest, the library would have been good enough for a financier." "One would have thought so," agreed Prince Aribert. "But perhaps your master has a special reason. Tell me," he went on, changing the subject quickly, "how came it that you left the Prince, my nephew, at Ostend and returned to Posen?" "His orders, Prince," and old Hans, who had had a wide experience of royal whims and knew half the secrets of the courts of Europe, gave Aribert a look which might have meant anything. "He sent me back on an errand, your Highness." "And you were to rejoin him here?" "Just so, Highness, and I did rejoin him here, although, to tell the truth, I had begun to fear that I might never see my master again." "The Prince has been very ill in Ostend, Hans." "So I have gathered," Hans responded dryly, slowly rubbing his hands together, "and his Highness is not yet perfectly recovered." "Not yet. We despaired of his life, Hans, at one time, but thanks to an excellent constitution he came safely through the ordeal. We must take care of him, your Highness." "Yes, indeed," said Aribert solemnly. "His life is very precious to Posen." At that moment Eugen, hereditary Prince of Posen, entered the audience chamber. He was pale and languid, and his uniform seemed to be a trouble to him. His hair had been slightly ruffled, and there was a look of uneasiness, almost of alarmed unrest, in his fine dark eyes. He was like a man who is afraid to look behind him, lest he should see something there which ought not to be there. But at the same time here beyond doubt was royalty. Nothing could have been more striking than the contrast between Eugen, a sick man in the shabby house at Ostend, and this Prince Eugen in the royal apartments of the Grand Babylon Hotel, surrounded by the luxury and pomp which modern civilization can offer to those born in high places. All the desperate episode of Ostend was now hidden, passed over. It was supposed never to have occurred. It existed only like a secret shame in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. Prince Eugen had recovered, at any rate he was convalescent, and he had been removed to London, where he took up again the dropped thread of his princely life. The lady with the red hat, the incorruptible and savage Miss Spencer, the unscrupulous and brilliant Jules, the dark damp cellar, the horrible little bedroom, these things were over. Thanks to Prince Aribert and the Racksoles he had emerged from them in safety. He was able to resume his public and official career. The Emperor had been informed of his safe arrival in London after an unavoidable delay in Ostend. His name once more figured in the court chronicle of the newspapers. In short, everything was smothered over. Only Jules, Rocco, and Miss Spencer were still at large, and the body of Reginald Dimmock lay buried in the domestic mausoleum of the palace at Posen, and Prince Eugen had still to interview Mr Sampson Levi. That various matters lay heavy on the mind of Prince Eugen was beyond question. He seemed to have withdrawn within himself. Despite the extraordinary experiences through which he had recently passed, events which called aloud for explanations and confidence between the nephew and the uncle, he would say scarcely a word to Prince Aribert. Any allusion, however direct, to the days at Ostend was ignored by him with more or less ingenuity, and Prince Aribert was really no nearer a full solution of the mystery of Jules' plot than he had been on the night when he and Racksole visited the gaming tables at Ostend. Eugen was well aware that he had been kidnapped through the agency of the woman in the red hat, but, doubtless ashamed at having been her dupe, he would not proceed in any way with the clearing up of the matter. "You will receive in this room, Eugen?" Aribert questioned him. "Yes," was the answer, given pettishly. "Why not? Even if I have no proper retinue here, surely that is no reason why I should not hold audience in a proper manner. Hans, you can go." The old valet promptly disappeared. "Aribert," the hereditary prince continued, when they were alone in the chamber, "you think I'm mad." "My dear Eugen," said Prince Aribert, startled in spite of himself, "don't be absurd." "I say you think I'm mad. You think that attack of brain fever has left its permanent mark on me. Well, perhaps I am mad. Who can tell? God knows that I have been through enough lately to drive me mad." Aribert made no reply. As a matter of strict fact, the thought had crossed his mind that Eugen's brain had not yet recovered its normal tone and activity. This speech of his nephew's, however, had the effect of immediately restoring his belief in the latter's entire sanity. He felt convinced that if only he could regain his nephew's confidence, the old brotherly confidence which had existed between them since the years when they played together as boys, all might yet be well. But at present there appeared to be no sign that Eugen meant to give his confidence to anyone. The young prince had come up out of the valley of the shadow of death, but some of the valley's shadow had clung to him, and it seemed he was unable to dissipate it. "By the way," said Eugen suddenly, "I must reward these Racksoles, I suppose. I am indeed grateful to them. If I gave the girl a bracelet and the father 1,000 guineas, how would that meet the case?" "My dear Eugen!" exclaimed Aribert aghast. 1,000 guineas! Do you know that Theodore Racksole could buy up all Posen from end to end without making himself a pauper? 1,000 guineas! You might as well offer him sixpence." "Then what must I offer?" "Nothing, except your thanks. Anything else would be an insult. These are no ordinary hotel people." "Can't I give the little girl a bracelet?" Prince Eugen gave a sinister laugh. Aribert looked at him steadily. "No," he said. "Why did you kiss her that night?" asked Prince Eugen carelessly. "Kiss whom?" said Aribert, blushing and angry, despite his most determined efforts to keep calm and unconcerned. "The Racksole girl." "When do you mean?" "I mean," said Prince Eugen, "that night in Ostend when I was ill. You thought I was in a delirium. Perhaps I was. But somehow I remember that with extraordinary distinctness. I remember raising my head for a fraction of an instant, and just in that fraction of an instant you kissed her. Oh, Uncle Aribert!" "Listen, Eugen, for God's sake. I love Nella Racksole. I shall marry her." "You?" There was a long pause, and then Eugen laughed. "Ah!" he said, "they all talk like that to start with. I have talked like that myself, dear uncle. It sounds nice, and it means nothing." "In this case it means everything, Eugen," said Aribert quietly. Some accent of determination in the latter's tone made Eugen rather more serious. "You can't marry her," he said. "The Emperor won't permit a morganatic marriage." "The Emperor has nothing to do with the affair. I shall renounce my rights. I shall become a plain citizen." "In which case you will have no fortune to speak of." "But my wife will have a fortune. Knowing the sacrifices which I shall have made in order to marry her, she will not hesitate to place that fortune in my hands for our mutual use," said Aribert stiffly. "You will decidedly be rich," mused Eugen, as his ideas dwelt on Theodore Racksole's reputed wealth. "But have you thought of this?" he asked, and his mild eyes glowed again in a sort of madness. "Have you thought that I am unmarried, and might die at any moment, and then the throne will descend to you? To you, Aribert." "The throne will never descend to me, Eugen," said Aribert softly, "for you will live. You are thoroughly convalescent. You have nothing to fear." "It is the next 7 days that I fear," said Eugen. "The next 7 days? Why?" "I do not know, but I fear them. If I can survive them—" "Mr Sampson Levi, sire," Hans announced in a loud tone. Chapter 20. Mr Sampson Levi bids Prince Eugen good morning. Prince Eugen started. "I will see him," he said, with a gesture to Hans as if to indicate that Mr Sampson Levi might enter at once. "I beg one moment first," said Aribert, laying a hand gently on his nephew's arm, and giving old Hans a glance which had the effect of precipitating that admirably trained servant through the doorway. "What is it?" asked Prince Eugen crossly. "Why this sudden seriousness? Don't forget that I have an appointment with Mr Sampson Levi, and must not keep him waiting. Someone said that punctuality is the politeness of princes." "Eugen," said Aribert, "I wish you to be as serious as I am. Why cannot we have faith in each other? I want to help you. I have helped you. You are my titular sovereign. But on the other hand, I have the honour to be your uncle. I have the honour to be the same age as you, and to have been your companion from youth up. Give me your confidence. I thought you had given it me years ago, but have lately discovered that you had your secrets even then. And now, since your illness, you are still more secretive." "What do you mean, Aribert?" said Eugen, in a tone which might have been either inimical or friendly. "What do you want to say?" "Well, in the first place, I want to say that you will not succeed with the estimable Mr Sampson Levi." "Shall I not?" said Eugen lightly. "How do you know what my business is with him?" "Suffice it to say that I know. You will never get that £1,000,000 out of him." Prince Eugen gasped, and then swallowed his excitement. "Who has been talking? What million?" His eyes wandered uneasily round the room. "Ah!" he said, pretending to laugh. "I see how it is. I have been chattering in my delirium. You mustn't take any notice of that, Aribert. When one has a fever, one's ideas become grotesque and fanciful." "You never talked in your delirium," Aribert replied, "at least not about yourself. I knew about this projected loan before I saw you in Ostend." "Who told you?" demanded Eugen fiercely. "Then you admit that you are trying to raise a loan?" "I admit nothing. Who told you?" "Theodore Racksole, the millionaire. These rich men have no secrets from each other. They form a coterie, closer than any coterie of ours, Eugen, and far more powerful. They talk, and in talking they rule the world, these millionaires. They are the real monarchs." "Curse them!" said Eugen. "Yes, perhaps so. But let me return to your case. Imagine my shame, my disgust, when I found that Racksole could tell me more about your affairs than I knew myself. Happily he is a good fellow, one can trust him. Otherwise I should have been tempted to do something desperate when I discovered that all your private history was in his hands. Eugen, let us come to the point. Why do you want that million? Is it actually true that you are so deeply in debt? I have no desire to improve the occasion. I merely ask." "And what if I do owe £1,000,000?" said Prince Eugen with assumed valour. "Oh, nothing, my dear Eugen, nothing. Only it is rather a large sum to have scattered in 10 years, is it not? How did you manage it?" "Don't ask, Aribert. I've been a fool. But I swear to you that the woman whom you call the lady in the red hat is the last of my follies. I am about to take a wife and become a respectable prince." "Then the engagement with Princess Anna is an accomplished fact?" "Practically so. As soon as I have settled with Levi, all will be smooth. Aribert, I wouldn't lose Anna for the imperial throne. She is a good and pure woman, and I love her as a man might love an angel." "And yet you would deceive her as to your debts, Eugen." "Not her, but her absurd parents, and perhaps the Emperor. They have heard rumours, and I must set those rumours at rest by presenting to them a clean sheet." "I am glad you have been frank with me, Eugen," said Prince Aribert, "but I will be plain with you. You will never marry the Princess Anna." "And why?" said Eugen, supercilious again. "Because her parents will not permit it. Because you will not be able to present a clean sheet to them. Because this Sampson Levi will never lend you £1,000,000. "Explain yourself." "I propose to do so. You were kidnapped it is a horrid word, but we must use it in Ostend." "True." "Do you know why?" "I suppose because that vile old red-headed woman and her accomplices wanted to get some money out of me. Fortunately, thanks to you, they didn't." "Not at all," said Aribert. "They wanted no money from you. They knew well enough that you had no money. They knew you were the naughty schoolboy among European princes, with no sense of responsibility or of duty towards your kingdom. Shall I tell you why they kidnapped you?" "When you have done abusing me, my dear uncle." "They kidnapped you merely to keep you out of England for a few days, merely to compel you to fail in your appointment with Sampson Levi, and it appears to me that they succeeded. Assuming that you don't obtain the money from Levi, is there another financier in all Europe from whom you can get it, on such strange security as you have to offer?" "Possibly there is not," said Prince Eugen calmly. "But, you see, I shall get it from Sampson Levi. Levi promised it, and I know from other sources that he is a man of his word. He said that the money, subject to certain formalities, would be available till—" "Till?" "Till the end of June." And it is now the end of July. Well, what is a month? He is only too glad to lend the money. He will get excellent interest. How on earth have you got into your sage old head this notion of a plot against me? The idea is ridiculous. A plot against me? What for? Have you ever thought of Bosnia? Asked Aribert coldly. What of Bosnia? I need not tell you that the King of Bosnia is naturally under obligations to Austria, to whom he owes his crown. Austria is anxious for him to make a good, influential marriage. Well, let him. He is going to. He is going to marry the Princess Anna. Not while I live. He made overtures there a year ago and was rebuffed. Yes, but he will make overtures again, and this time he will not be rebuffed. Oh, Eugen, can't you see that this plot against you is being engineered by some persons who know all about your affairs, and whose desire is to prevent your marriage with Princess Anna? Only one man in Europe can have any motive for wishing to prevent your marriage with Princess Anna, and that is the man who means to marry her himself. Eugen went very pale. Then, Aribert, do you mean to convey to me that my detention in Ostend was contrived by the agents of the King of Bosnia? I do. With a view to stopping my negotiations with Sampson Levi, and so putting an end to the possibility of my marriage with Anna? Aribert nodded. You are a good friend to me, Aribert. You mean well, but you are mistaken. You have been worrying about nothing. Have you forgotten about Reginald Dimmock? I remember you said that he had died. I said nothing of the sort. I said that he had been assassinated. That was part of it, my poor Eugen. Pooh, said Eugen. I don't believe he was assassinated. And as for Sampson Levi, I will bet you 1,000 marks that he and I come to terms this morning, and that the million is in my hands before I leave London. Aribert shook his head. You seem to be pretty sure of Mr. Levi's character. Have you had much to do with him before? Well, Eugen hesitated a second. A little. What young man in my position hasn't had something to do with Mr. Sampson Levi at one time or another? I haven't, said Aribert. You are a fossil. He rang a silver bell. Hans, I will receive Mr. Sampson Levi. Whereupon Aribert discreetly departed, and Prince Eugen sat down in the great velvet chair and began to look at the papers which Hans had previously placed upon the table. Good morning, your Royal Highness, said Sampson Levi, bowing as he entered. I trust your Royal Highness is well. Moderately, thanks, returned the Prince. In spite of the fact that he had had as much to do with people of royal blood as any plain man in Europe, Sampson Levi had never yet learned how to be at ease with these exalted individuals during the first few minutes of an interview. Afterwards he resumed command of himself and his faculties, but at the beginning he was invariably flustered, scarlet of face, and inclined to perspiration. We will proceed to business at once, said Prince Eugen. Will you take a seat, Mr. Levi? I thank your Royal Highness. Now as to that loan which we had already practically arranged. 1 million, I think it was, said the Prince airily. 1 million, Levi acquiesced, toying with his enormous watch chain. Everything is now in order. Here are the papers, and I should like to finish the matter up at once. Exactly, your Highness, but... But what? You months ago expressed the warmest satisfaction at the security, though I am quite prepared to admit that the security is of rather an unusual nature. You also agreed to the rate of interest. It is not everyone, Mr. Levi, who can lend out 1 million at 5.5%, and in 10 years the whole amount will be paid back. I believe I informed you that the fortune of Princess Anna, who is about to accept my hand, will ultimately amount to something like 50 millions of marks, which is over 2 million pounds in your English money. Prince Eugen stopped. He had no fancy for talking in this confidential manner to financiers, but he felt that circumstances demanded it. You see, it's like this, your Royal Highness, began Mr. Sampson Levi in his homely English idiom. It's like this. I said I could keep that bit of money available till the end of June, and you were to give me an interview here before that date. Not having heard from your Highness, and not knowing your Highness's address, though my German agents made every inquiry, I concluded that you had made other arrangements, money being so cheap these last few months." "I was unfortunately detained at Ostend," said Prince Eugen, with as much haughtiness as he could assume, "by important business. I have made no other arrangements, and I shall have need of the million. If you will be so good as to pay it to my London bankers—" "I am very sorry," said Mr Sampson Levi, with a tremendous and dazzling air of politeness which surprised even himself, "but my syndicate has now lent the money elsewhere. It is in South America. I don't mind telling your Highness that we've lent it to the Chilean Government." "Hang the Chilean Government, Mr Levi!" exclaimed the Prince, and he went white. "I must have that million. It was an arrangement." "It was an arrangement, I admit," said Mr Sampson Levi, "but your Highness broke the arrangement." There was a long silence. "Do you mean to say," began the Prince with tense calmness, "that you are not in a position to let me have that million?" "I could let your Highness have a million in a couple of years' time." The Prince made a gesture of annoyance. "Mr Levi," he said, "if you do not place the money in my hands tomorrow, you will ruin one of the oldest of reigning families, and incidentally you will alter the map of Europe. You are not keeping faith, and I had relied on you." "Pardon me, your Highness," said little Levi, rising in resentment. "It is not I who have not kept faith. I beg to repeat that the money is no longer at my disposal, and to bid your Highness good morning." And Mr Sampson Levi left the audience chamber with an awkward, aggrieved bow. It was a scene characteristic of the end of the 19th century, an overfed, commonplace, pursy little man who had been born in a Brixton semi-detached villa, and whose highest idea of pleasure was a Sunday up the river in an expensive electric launch, confronting and utterly routing, in a hotel belonging to an American millionaire, the representative of a race of men who had fingered every page of European history for centuries, and who still, in their native castles, were surrounded with every outward circumstance of pomp and power. "Aribert," said Prince Eugen a little later, "you were right. It is all over. I have only one refuge." "You don't mean—" Aribert stopped, dumbfounded. "Yes, I do," he said quickly. "I can manage it so that it will look like an accident." End of chapter 19 and 20. Chapter 21 and 22 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 21. The Return of Felix Babylon. On the evening of Prince Eugen's fateful interview with Mr Sampson Levi, Theodore Racksole was wandering somewhat aimlessly and uneasily about the entrance hall and adjacent corridors of the Grand Babylon. He had returned from Ostend only a day or two previously, and had endeavoured with all his might to forget the affair which had carried him there, to regard it, in fact, as done with. But he found himself unable to do so. In vain he remarked under his breath that there were some things which were best left alone. If his experience as a manipulator of markets, a contriver of gigantic schemes in New York, had taught him anything at all, it should surely have taught him that. Yet he could not feel reconciled to such a position. The mere presence of the Princess in his hotel roused the fighting instincts of this man, who had never in his whole career been beaten. He had, as it were, taken up arms on their side, and if the Princes of Posen would not continue their own battle, nevertheless he, Theodore Racksole, wanted to continue it for them. To a certain extent, of course, the battle had been won, for Prince Eugen had been rescued from an extremely difficult and dangerous position, and the enemy, consisting of Jules, Rocco, Miss Spencer, and perhaps others, had been put to flight. But that, he conceived, was not enough. It was very far from being enough. That the criminals, for criminals they decidedly were, should still be at large, he regarded as an absurd anomaly. And there was another point. He had said nothing to the police of all that had occurred. He disdained the police, but he could scarcely fail to perceive that if the police should by accident gain a clue to the real state of the case, he might be placed rather awkwardly, for the simple reason that in the eyes of the law it amounted to a misdemeanour to conceal as much as he had concealed. He asked himself, for the thousandth time, why he had adopted a policy of concealment from the police, why he had become in any way interested in the Posen matter, and why, at this present moment, he should be so anxious to prosecute it further. To the first two questions he replied, rather lamely, that he had been influenced by Nella, and also by a natural spirit of adventure. To the third he replied that he had always been in the habit of carrying things through, and was now actuated by a mere childish, obstinate desire to carry this one through. Moreover, he was splendidly conscious of his perfect ability to carry it through. One additional impulse he had, though he did not admit it to himself, being by nature adverse to big words, and that was an abstract love of justice, the Anglo-Saxon's deep-found instinct for helping the right side to conquer, even when grave risks must thereby be run, with no corresponding advantage. He was turning these things over in his mind as he walked about the vast hotel on that evening of the last day in July. The society papers had been stating for a week past that London was empty, but, in spite of the society papers, London persisted in seeming to be just as full as ever. The Grand Babylon was certainly not as crowded as it had been a month earlier, but it was doing a very passable business. At the close of the season the gay butterflies of the social community have a habit of hovering for a day or two in the big hotels, before they flutter away to castle and country house, meadow and moor, lake and stream. The great basket chairs in the portico were well filled by old and middle-aged gentlemen engaged in enjoying the varied delights of liqueurs, cigars, and the full moon which floated so serenely above the Thames. Here and there a pretty woman, on the arm of a cavalier in immaculate attire, swept her train as she turned to and fro in the promenade of the terrace. Waiters and uniformed commissionaires and gold-braided doorkeepers moved noiselessly about. At short intervals the chief of the doorkeepers blew his shrill whistle, and hansoms drove up with tinkling bell to take away a pair of butterflies to some place of amusement or boredom. Occasionally a private carriage, drawn by expensive and self-conscious horses, put the hansoms to shame by its mere outward glory. It was a hot night, a night for the summer woods, and save for the vehicles there was no rapid movement of any kind. It seemed as though the world, that is to say, of the Grand Babylon, was fully engaged in the solemn processes of digestion and small talk. Even the long row of the Embankment gas lamps, stretching right and left, scarcely trembled in the still, warm, caressing air. The stars overhead looked down with many blinkings upon the enormous pile of the Grand Babylon, and the moon regarded it with bland and changeless face. What they thought of it and its inhabitants cannot, unfortunately, be recorded. What Theodore Racksole thought of the moon can be recorded. He thought it was a nuisance. It somehow fascinated his gaze with its silly stare, and so interfered with his complex meditations. He glanced round at the well-dressed and satisfied people, his guests, his customers. They appeared to ignore him absolutely. Probably only a very small percentage of them had the least idea that this tall, spare man, with the iron-grey hair and the thin, firm, resolute face, who wore his American-cut evening clothes with such careless ease, was the sole proprietor of the Grand Babylon, and possibly the richest man in Europe. As has already been stated, Racksole was not a celebrity in England. The guests of the Grand Babylon saw merely a restless male person, whose restlessness was rather a disturber of their quietude, but with whom, to judge by his countenance, it would be inadvisable to remonstrate. Therefore Theodore Racksole continued his perambulations unchallenged, and kept saying to himself, "I must do something." But what? He could think of no course to pursue. At last he walked straight through the hotel and out at the other entrance, and so up the little unassuming side street into the roaring torrent of the narrow and crowded Strand. He jumped on a Putney bus and paid his fare to Putney, 5d, and then, finding that the humble occupants of the vehicle stared at the spectacle of a man in evening dress but without a dust-coat, he jumped off again, oblivious of the fact that the conductor jerked a thumb towards him and winked at the passengers as who should say, "There goes a lunatic." He went into a tobacconist's shop and asked for a cigar. The shopman mildly inquired what price. "What are the best you've got?" asked Theodore Racksole. 5 shillings each, sir," said the man promptly. "Give me a penny one," was Theodore Racksole's laconic request, and he walked out of the shop smoking the penny cigar. It was a new sensation for him. He was inhaling the aromatic odours of Eugene Rimmel's establishment for the sale of scents, when a gentleman, walking slowly in the opposite direction, accosted him with a quiet, "Good evening, Mr Racksole." The millionaire did not at first recognize his interlocutor, who wore a travelling overcoat and was carrying a handbag. Then a slight, pleased smile passed over his features, and he held out his hand. "Well, Mr Babylon," he greeted the other, "of all persons in the wide world you are the man I would most have wished to meet." "You flatter me," said the little anglicised Swiss. "No, I don't," answered Racksole. "It isn't my custom, any more than it's yours. I wanted to have a real good long yarn with you, and lo, here you are. Where have you sprung from?" "From Lausanne," said Felix Babylon. "I had finished my duties there, and I had nothing else to do, and I felt homesick. I felt the nostalgia of London, and so I came over, just as you see," and he raised the handbag for Racksole's notice. "One toothbrush, one razor, 2 slippers, eh?" He laughed. "I was wondering as I walked along where I should stay. Me, Felix Babylon, homeless in London." "I should advise you to stay at the Grand Babylon," Racksole laughed back. "It is a good hotel, and I know the proprietor personally." "Rather expensive, is it not?" said Babylon. "To you, sir," answered Racksole, "the inclusive terms will be exactly half a crown a week. Do you accept?" "I accept," said Babylon, and added, "You are very good, Mr Racksole." They strolled together back to the hotel, saying nothing in particular, but feeling very content with each other's company. "Many customers?" asked Felix Babylon. "Very tolerable," said Racksole, assuming as much of the air of the professional hotel proprietor as he could. "I think I may say, in the storekeeper's phrase, that if there is any business about, I am doing it. Tonight the people are all on the terrace in the portico. It's so confoundedly hot, and the consumption of ice is simply enormous, nearly as large as it would be in New York." "In that case," said Babylon politely, "let me offer you another cigar." "But I have not finished this one." "That is just why I wish to offer you another one. A cigar such as yours, my good friend, ought never to be smoked within the precincts of the Grand Babylon, not even by the proprietor of the Grand Babylon, and especially when all the guests are assembled in the portico. The fumes of it would ruin any hotel." Theodore Racksole laughingly lighted the Rothschild Havana which Babylon gave him, and they entered the hotel arm in arm. But no sooner had they mounted the steps than little Felix became the object of numberless greetings. It appeared that he had been highly popular among his quondam guests. At last they reached the managerial room, where Babylon was regaled on a chicken, and Racksole assisted him in the consumption of a bottle of Heidsieck Monopole, Carte d'Or. "This chicken is almost perfectly grilled," said Babylon at length. "It is a credit to the house. But why, my dear Racksole, why in the name of heaven did you quarrel with Rocco?" "Then you've heard?" "Heard? My dear friend, it was in every newspaper on the continent. Some journals prophesied that the Grand Babylon would have to close its doors within half a year, now that Rocco had deserted it. But of course I knew better. I knew that you must have a good reason for allowing Rocco to depart, and that you must have made arrangements in advance for a substitute." "As a matter of fact, I had not made arrangements in advance," said Theodore Racksole, a little ruefully. "But happily we found in our second sous-chef an artist inferior only to Rocco himself. That, however, was mere good fortune." "Surely," said Babylon, "it was indiscreet to trust to mere good fortune in such a serious matter." "I didn't trust to mere good fortune. I didn't trust to anything except Rocco, and he deceived me." "But why did you quarrel with him?" "I didn't quarrel with him. I found him embalming a corpse in the state bedroom one night." "You what?" Babylon almost screamed. "I found him embalming a corpse in the state bedroom," repeated Racksole in his quietest tones. The two men gazed at each other, and then Racksole replenished Babylon's glass. "Tell me," said Babylon, settling himself deep in an easy chair and lighting a cigar. And Racksole thereupon recounted to him the whole of the Posen episode, with every circumstantial detail so far as he knew it. It was a long and complicated recital, and occupied about an hour. During that time little Felix never spoke a word, scarcely moved a muscle. Only his small eyes gazed through the bluish haze of smoke. The clock on the mantelpiece tinkled midnight. "Time for whisky and soda," said Racksole, and got up as if to ring the bell, but Babylon waved him back. You have told me that this Samson Levi had an audience of Prince Eugen today, but you have not told me the result of that audience," said Babylon. "Because I do not yet know it, but I shall doubtless know tomorrow. In the meantime I feel fairly sure that Levi declined to produce Prince Eugen's required million. I have reason to believe that the money was lent elsewhere." Mused Babylon, and then, carelessly, "I am not at all surprised at that arrangement for spying through the bathroom of the State apartments." "Why are you not surprised?" "Oh," said Babylon, "it is such an obvious dodge, so easy to carry out. As for me, I took special care never to involve myself in these affairs. I knew they existed, I somehow felt that they existed. But I also felt that they lay outside my sphere. My business was to provide board and lodging of the most sumptuous kind to those who didn't mind paying for it. And I did my business. If anything else went on in the hotel, under the rose, I long determined to ignore it unless it should happen to be brought before my notice. And it never was brought before my notice. However, I admit that there is a certain pleasurable excitement in this kind of affair, and doubtless you have experienced that." "I have," said Racksole simply, "though I believe you are laughing at me." "By no means," Babylon replied. "Now what, if I may ask the question, is going to be your next step?" "That is just what I desire to know myself," said Theodore Racksole. "Well," said Babylon after a pause, "let us begin. In the first place, it is possible you may be interested to hear that I happened to see Jules today." "You did?" Racksole remarked with much calmness. "Where?" "Well, it was early this morning, in Paris, just before I left there. The meeting was quite accidental, and Jules seemed rather surprised at meeting me. He respectfully inquired where I was going, and I said that I was going to Switzerland. At that moment I thought I was going to Switzerland. It had occurred to me that after all I should be happier there, and that I had better turn back and not see London any more. However, I changed my mind once again, and decided to come on to London, and accept the risks of being miserable there without my hotel. Then I asked Jules whither he was bound, and he told me that he was off to Constantinople, being interested in a new French hotel there. I wished him good luck, and we parted." "Constantinople, eh?" said Racksole. "A highly suitable place for him, I should say." "But," Babylon resumed, "I caught sight of him again." "Where?" "At Charing Cross, a few minutes before I had the pleasure of meeting you. Mr. Jules had not gone to Constantinople after all. He did not see me, or I should have suggested to him that in going from Paris to Constantinople it is not usual to travel via London." "The cheek of the fellow!" exclaimed Theodore Racksole. "The gorgeous and colossal cheek of the fellow!" Chapter 22 In the Wine Cellars of the Grand Babylon. "Do you know anything of the antecedents of this Jules?" asked Theodore Racksole, helping himself to whisky. "Nothing whatever," said Babylon. "Until you told me, I don't think I was aware that his true name was Thomas Jackson, though of course I knew that it was not Jules. I certainly was not aware that Miss Spencer was his wife, but I had long suspected that their relations were somewhat more intimate than the nature of their respective duties in the hotel absolutely demanded. All that I do know of Jules, who will always be called Jules, is that he gradually, by some mysterious personal force, acquired a prominent position in the hotel. Decidedly he was the cleverest and most intellectual waiter I have ever known, and he was specially skilled in the difficult task of retaining his own dignity while not interfering with that of other people. I am afraid this information is a little too vague to be of any practical assistance in the present difficulty." "What is the present difficulty?" Racksole queried, with a simple air. "I should imagine that the present difficulty is to account for the man's presence in London." "That is easily accounted for," said Racksole. "How? Do you suppose he is anxious to give himself up to justice, or that the chains of habit bind him to the hotel?" "Neither," said Racksole. "Jules is going to have another try, that's all." "Another try at what?" "At Prince Eugen. Either at his life or his liberty. Most probably the former this time. Almost certainly the former. He has guessed that we are somewhat handicapped by our anxiety to keep Prince Eugen's predicament quite quiet, and he is taking advantage of that fact. As he already is fairly rich, on his own admission, the reward which has been offered to him must be enormous, and he is absolutely determined to get it. He has several times recently proved himself to be a daring fellow. Unless I am mistaken, he will shortly prove himself to be still more daring." "But what can he do? Surely you don't suggest that he will attempt the life of Prince Eugen in this hotel?" "Why not? If Reginald Dimmock fell on mere suspicion that he would turn out unfaithful to the conspiracy, why not Prince Eugen?" "But it would be an unspeakable crime, and do infinite harm to the hotel." "True," Racksole admitted, smiling. Little Felix Babylon seemed to brace himself for the grasping of his monstrous idea. "How could it possibly be done?" he asked at length. "Dimmock was poisoned." "Yes, but you had Rocco here then, and Rocco was in the plot. It is conceivable that Rocco could have managed it. Barely conceivable. But without Rocco I cannot think it possible. I cannot even think that Jules would attempt it. You see, in a place like the Grand Babylon, as probably I needn't point out to you, food has to pass through so many hands that to poison one person without killing perhaps 50 would be a most delicate operation. Moreover, Prince Eugen, unless he has changed his habits, is always served by his own attendant, old Hans, and therefore any attempt to tamper with the cooked dish immediately before serving would be hazardous in the extreme." "Granted," said Racksole. "The wine, however, might be more easily got at. Had you thought of that?" "I had not," Babylon admitted. "You are an ingenious theorist, but I happen to know that Prince Eugen always has his wine opened in his own presence. No doubt it would be opened by Hans. Therefore the wine theory is not tenable, my friend." "I do not see why," said Racksole, "and I very seldom drink it, but it seems to me that a bottle of wine might be tampered with while it was still in the cellar, especially if there was an accomplice in the hotel." "You think then that you are not yet rid of all your conspirators?" "I think that Jules might still have an accomplice within the building." "And that a bottle of wine could be opened and recorked without leaving any trace of the operation?" Babylon was a trifle sarcastic. "I don't see the necessity of opening the bottle in order to poison the wine," said Racksole. "I've never tried to poison anybody by means of a bottle of wine, and I don't lay claim to any natural talent as a poisoner, but I think I could devise several ways of managing the trick. Of course, I admit I may be entirely mistaken as to Jules' intentions." "Ah," said Felix Babylon, "the wine cellars beneath us are one of the wonders of London. I hope you are aware, Mr Racksole, that when you bought the Grand Babylon you bought what is probably the finest stock of wines in England, if not in Europe. In the valuation I reckoned them at £60,000, and I may say that I always took care that the cellars were properly guarded. Even Jules would experience a serious difficulty in breaking into the cellars without the connivance of the wine clerk, and the wine clerk is, or was, incorruptible." "I am ashamed to say that I have not yet inspected my wines," smiled Racksole. "I have never given them a thought. Once or twice I have taken the trouble to make a tour of the hotel, but I omitted the cellars in my excursions." "Impossible, my dear fellow," said Babylon, amused at such a confession, to him, a great connoisseur and lover of fine wines, almost incredible. "But really you must see them tomorrow. If I may, I will accompany you." "Why not tonight?" Racksole suggested calmly. "Tonight? It is very late. Hubbard will have gone to bed." "And may I ask who is Hubbard? I remember the name but dimly." "Hubbard is the wine clerk of the Grand Babylon," said Felix with a certain emphasis. "A sedate man of 40. He has the keys of the cellars. He knows every bottle of every bin, its date, its qualities, its value. And he is a teetotaler. Hubbard is a curiosity. No wine can leave the cellars without his knowledge, and no person can enter the cellars without his knowledge. At least that is how it was in my time," Babylon added. "We will wake him," said Racksole. "But it is 1 o'clock in the morning," Babylon protested. "Never mind. That is, if you consent to accompany me. A cellar is the same by night as by day. Therefore, why not now?" Babylon shrugged his shoulders. "As you wish," he agreed, with his indestructible politeness. "And now to find this Mr Hubbard, with his key of the cupboard," said Racksole, as they walked out of the room together. Although the hour was so late, the hotel was not, of course, closed for the night. A few guests still remained about in the public rooms, and a few fatigued waiters were still in attendance. One of these latter was dispatched in search of the singular Mr Hubbard, and it fortunately turned out that this gentleman had not actually retired, though he was on the point of doing so. He brought the keys to Mr Racksole in person, and after he had had a little chat with his former master, the proprietor and the ex-proprietor of the Grand Babylon Hotel proceeded on their way to the cellars. These cellars extend over, or rather under, quite half the superficial areas of the whole hotel, the longitudinal half, which lies next to the Strand. Owing to the fact that the ground slopes sharply from the Strand to the river, the Grand Babylon is, so to speak, deeper near the Strand than it is near the Thames. Towards the Thames there is, below the entrance level, a basement and a sub-basement. Towards the Strand there is basement, sub-basement, and the huge wine cellars beneath all. After descending the 4 flights of the service stairs, and traversing a long passage running parallel with the kitchen, the two found themselves opposite a door, which, on being unlocked, gave access to another flight of stairs. At the foot of this was the main entrance to the cellars. Outside the entrance was the wine lift, for the ascension of delicious fluids to the upper floors, and opposite, Mr Hubbard's little office. There was electric light everywhere. Babylon, who, as being most accustomed to them, held the bunch of keys, opened the great door, and then they were in the first cellar, the first of a suite of 5. Racksole was struck not only by the icy coolness of the place, but also by its vastness. Babylon had seized a portable electric hand light, attached to a long wire, which lay handy, and, waving it about, disclosed the dimensions of the place. By that flashing illumination the subterranean chamber looked unutterably weird and mysterious, with its rows of numbered bins stretching away into the distance till their radiance was reduced to the occasional far gleam of the light on the shoulder of a bottle. Then Babylon switched on the fixed electric lights, and Theodore Racksole entered upon a personally conducted tour of what was quite the most interesting part of his own property. To see the innocent enthusiasm of Felix Babylon for these stores of exhilarating liquid was what is called in the North a sight for saroyne. He displayed to Racksole's bewildered gaze, in their due order, all the wines of 3 continents, nay, of 4, for the superb and luscious Constantia wine of Cape Colony was not wanting in that most catholic collection of vintages. Beginning with the unsurpassed products of Burgundy, he continued with the clarets of Medoc, Bordeaux, and Sauternes, then to the champagnes of Aix, Hautvilliers, and Pierry, then to the Hocks and Moselle of Germany, and the brilliant imitation champagnes of Maine, Neckar, and Naumburg, then to the famous and adorable Tokay of Hungary, and all the Austrian varieties of French wines, including Karlowitz and Sumlauer, then to the dry sherries of Spain, including purest Manzanilla, and Amontillado, and Vino de Pasto, then to the wines of Malaga, both sweet and dry, and all the Spanish reds from Catalonia, including the dark tent, so often used sacramentally, then to the renowned port of Oporto. Then he proceeded to the Italian cellar, and descanted upon the excellence of Barolo from Piedmont, of Chianti from Tuscany, of Orvieto from the Roman States, of the Tears of Christ from Naples, and the commoner Marsala from Sicily, and so on, to an extent and with a fullness of detail which cannot be rendered here. At the end of the suite of cellars there was a glazed door, which, as could be seen, gave access to a supplemental and smaller cellar, an apartment about 15 or 16 feet square. "Anything special in there?" asked Racksole curiously, as they stood before the door and looked within at the serried ends of bottles. "Ah!" exclaimed Babylon, almost smacking his lips, "therein lies the cream of all." "The best champagne, I suppose," said Racksole. "Yes," said Babylon, "the best champagne is there, a very special Sillery, as exquisite as you will find anywhere. But I see, my friend, that you fall into the common error of putting champagne first among wines. That distinction belongs to Burgundy. You have old Burgundy in that cellar, Mr Racksole, which cost me—how much do you think? £80 a bottle. Probably it will never be drunk," he added with a sigh. "It is too expensive even for princes and plutocrats." "Yes, it will," said Racksole quickly. "You and I will have a bottle up tomorrow." "Then," continued Babylon, still riding his hobby horse, "there is a sample of the Rhine wine, dated 1706, which caused such a sensation at the Vienna Exhibition of 1873. There is also a singularly glorious Persian wine from Shiraz, the like of which I have never seen elsewhere. Also there is an unrivalled vintage of Romanée Conti, greatest of all modern Burgundies. If I remember right, Prince Eugen invariably has a bottle when he comes to stay here. It is not on the hotel wine list, of course, and only a few customers know of it. We do not precisely hawk it about the dining room." "Indeed," said Racksole. "Let us go inside." They entered the stone apartment, rendered almost sacred by the preciousness of its contents, and Racksole looked round with a strangely intent and curious air. At the far side was a grating, through which came a feeble light. "What is that?" asked the millionaire sharply. "That is merely a ventilation grating. Good ventilation is absolutely essential." "Looks broken, doesn't it?" Racksole suggested, and then, putting a finger quickly on Babylon's shoulder, "There's someone in the cellar. Can't you hear breathing, down there, behind that bin?" The two men stood tense and silent for a while, listening, under the ray of the single electric light in the ceiling. Half the cellar was involved in gloom. At length Racksole walked firmly down the central passageway between the bins and turned to the corner at the right. "Come out, you villain!" he said in a low, well-nigh vicious tone, and dragged up a cowering figure. He had expected to find a man, but it was his own daughter, Nella Racksole, upon whom he had laid angry hands. End of chapter 21 and 22. Chapter 23 and 24 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 23. Further Events in the Cellar. "Well, father," Nella greeted her astounded parent, "you should make sure that you've got hold of the right person before you use all that terrible muscular force of yours. I do believe you have broken my shoulder bone." She rubbed her shoulder with a comical expression of pain, and then stood up before the two men. The skirt of her dark grey dress was torn and dirty, and the usually trim Nella looked as though she had been shot down a canvas fire escape. Mechanically she smoothed her frock and gave a straightening touch to her hair. "Good evening, Mr Racksole," said Felix Babylon, bowing formally. "This is an unexpected pleasure." Felix's drawing-room manners never deserted him upon any occasion whatever. "May I inquire what you are doing in my wine cellar, Nella Racksole?" said the millionaire a little stiffly. He was certainly somewhat annoyed at having mistaken his daughter for a criminal. Moreover, he hated to be surprised, and upon this occasion he had been surprised beyond any ordinary surprise. Lastly, he was not at all pleased that Nella should be observed in that strange predicament by a stranger. "I will tell you," said Nella. "I had been reading rather late in my room. The night was so close. I heard Big Ben strike 12:30, and then I put the book down and went out onto the balcony of my window for a little fresh air before going to bed. I leaned over the balcony very quietly, you will remember that I am on the 3rd floor now, and looked down below into the little sunk yard which separates the wall of the hotel from Salisbury Lane. I was rather astonished to see a figure creeping across the yard. I knew there was no entrance into the hotel from that yard, and besides, it is 15 or 20 feet below the level of the street. So I watched. The figure went close up against the wall and disappeared from my view. I leant over the balcony as far as I dared, but I couldn't see him. I could hear him, however." "What could you hear?" questioned Racksole sharply. "It sounded like a sawing noise," said Nella, "and it went on for quite a long time, nearly a quarter of an hour, I should think. A rasping sort of noise." "Why on earth didn't you come and warn me or someone else in the hotel?" asked Racksole. "Oh, I don't know, Dad," she replied sweetly. "I got interested in it, and I thought I would see it out myself. Well, as I was saying, Mr Babylon," she continued, addressing her remarks to Felix, with a dazzling smile, "that noise went on for quite a long time. At last it stopped, and the figure reappeared from under the wall, crossed the yard, climbed up the opposite wall by some means or other, and so over the railings into Salisbury Lane. I felt rather relieved then, because I knew he hadn't actually broken into the hotel. He walked down Salisbury Lane very slowly. A policeman was just coming up. 'Good night, officer,' I heard him say to the policeman, and he asked him for a match. The policeman supplied the match, and the other man lighted a cigarette and proceeded further down the lane. By cricking your neck from my window, Mr Babylon, you can get a glimpse of the embankment and the river. I saw the man cross the embankment and lean over the river wall, where he seemed to be talking to someone. He then walked along the Embankment to Westminster, and that was the last I saw of him. I waited a minute or two for him to come back, but he didn't come back, and so I thought it was about time I began to make inquiries into the affair. I went downstairs instantly, and out of the hotel, through the quadrangle, into Salisbury Lane, and I looked over those railings. There was a ladder on the other side, by which it was perfectly easy, once you had got over the railings, to climb down into the yard. I was horribly afraid lest someone might walk up Salisbury Lane and catch me in the act of negotiating those railings, but no one did, and I surmounted them, with no worse damage than a torn skirt. I crossed the yard on tiptoe, and I found that, in the wall, close to the ground and almost exactly under my window, there was an iron grating, about 1 foot by 14 inches. I suspected, as there was no other ironwork near, that the mysterious visitor must have been sawing at this grating for private purposes of his own. I gave it a good shake, and I was not at all surprised that a good part of it came off in my hand, leaving just enough room for a person to creep through. I decided that I would creep through, and now I wish I hadn't. I don't know, Mr. Babylon, whether you have ever tried to creep through a small hole with a skirt on. Have you? I have not had that pleasure, said little Felix, bowing again, and absently taking up a bottle which lay to his hand. Well, you are fortunate, the imperturbable Nella resumed. For quite 3 minutes I thought I should perish in that grating, Dad, with my shoulder inside and the rest of me outside. However, at last, by the most amazing and agonizing efforts, I pulled myself through, and fell into this extraordinary cellar, more dead than alive. Then I wondered what I should do next. Should I wait for the mysterious visitor to return, and stab him with my pocket scissors if he tried to enter, or should I raise an alarm? First of all I replaced the broken grating, then I struck a match, and I saw that I had got landed in a wilderness of bottles. The match went out, and I hadn't another one, so I sat down in the corner to think. I just decided to wait and see if the visitor returned, when I heard footsteps, and then voices, and then you came in. I must say I was rather taken aback, especially as I recognized the voice of Mr. Babylon. You see, I didn't want to frighten you. If I'd bobbed up from behind the bottles and said boo, you would have had a serious shock. I wanted to think of a way of breaking my presence gently to you. But you saved me the trouble, Dad. Was I really breathing so loudly that you could hear me? The girl ended her strange recital, and there was a moment's silence in the cellar. Racksole merely nodded an affirmative to her concluding question. Well, Nella, my girl, said the millionaire at length, we are much obliged for your gymnastic efforts, very much obliged. But now I think you had better go off to bed. There is going to be some serious trouble here, I'll lay my last dollar on that. But if there is to be a burglary, I should so like to see it, Dad, Nella pleaded. I've never seen a burglar caught red-handed. This isn't a burglary, my dear. I calculate it's something far worse than a burglary. What? She cried. Murder? Arson? Dynamite plot? How perfectly splendid! Mr. Babylon informs me that Jules is in London, said Racksole quietly. Jules! She exclaimed under her breath, and her tone changed instantly to the utmost seriousness. Switch off the light, quick! Springing to the switch, she put the cellar in darkness. What's that for? Said her father. If he comes back he would see the light and be frightened away, said Nella. That wouldn't do at all. It wouldn't, Miss Racksole, said Babylon, and there was in his voice a note of admiration for the girl's sagacity which Racksole heard with high paternal pride. Listen, Nella, said the latter, drawing his daughter to him in the profound gloom of the cellar. We fancy that Jules may be trying to tamper with a certain bottle of wine, a bottle which might possibly be drunk by Prince Eugen. Now do you think that the man you saw might have been Jules? I hadn't previously thought of him as being Jules, but immediately you mentioned the name I somehow knew that he was. Yes, I'm sure it was Jules. Well, just hear what I have to say. There's no time to lose. If he is coming at all, he will be here very soon, and you can help. Racksole explained what he thought Jules' tactics might be. He proposed that if the man returned he should not be interfered with, but merely watched from the other side of the glass door. You want, as it were, to catch Mr. Jules alive, said Babylon, who seemed rather taken aback at this novel method of dealing with criminals. Surely, he added, it would be simpler and easier to inform the police of your suspicion, and to leave everything to them." "My dear fellow," said Racksole, "we have already gone much too far without the police to make it advisable for us to call them in at this somewhat advanced stage of the proceedings. Besides, if you must know it, I have a particular desire to capture the scoundrel myself. I will leave you and Nella here, since Nella insists on seeing everything, and I will arrange things so that once he has entered the cellar, Jules will not get out of it again, at any rate through the grating. You had better place yourself on the other side of the glass door in the big cellar. You will be in a position to observe from there. I will skip off at once. All you have to do is to take note of what the fellow does. If he has any accomplices within the hotel, we shall probably be able by that means to discover who the accomplice is." Lighting a match and shading it with his hands, Racksole showed them both out of the little cellar. "Now, if you lock this glass door on the outside, he can't escape this way. The panes of glass are too small and the woodwork too stout. So, if he comes into the trap, you two will have the pleasure of actually seeing him frantically writhe therein, without any personal danger. But perhaps you'd better not show yourselves." In another moment Felix Babylon and Nella were left to themselves in the darkness of the cellar, listening to the receding footfalls of Theodore Racksole. But the sound of these footfalls had not died away before another sound greeted their ears. The grating of the small cellar was being removed. "I hope your father will be in time," whispered Felix. "Hush!" the girl warned him, and they stood side by side in tense silence. A man, cautiously but very neatly, wormed his body through the aperture of the grating. The watchers could only see his form indistinctly in the darkness. Then, being fairly within the cellar, he walked without the least hesitation to the electric switch and turned on the light. It was unmistakably Jules, and he knew the geography of the cellar very well. Babylon could with difficulty repress a start as he saw this bold and unscrupulous ex-waiter moving with such an air of assurance and determination about the precious cellar. Jules went directly to a small bin which was numbered 17, and took therefrom the topmost bottle. "The Romani Conti, Prince Eugen's wine," Babylon exclaimed under his breath. Jules neatly and quickly removed the seal with an instrument which he had clearly brought for the purpose. He then took a little flat box from his pocket, which seemed to contain a sort of black salve. Rubbing his finger on this, he smeared the top of the neck of the bottle with it, just where the cork came against the glass. In another instant he had deftly replaced the seal and restored the bottle to its position. He then turned off the light and made for the aperture. When he was halfway through, Nella exclaimed, "He will escape after all! Dad has not had time! We must stop him!" But Babylon, that embodiment of caution, forcibly, but nevertheless politely, restrained this Yankee girl, whom he deemed so rash and imprudent, and before she could free herself the lithe form of Jules had disappeared. Chapter 24. The Bottle of Wine. As regards Theodore Racksole, who was to have caught this man from the outside of the cellar, he made his way as rapidly as possible from the wine cellars up to the ground floor, out of the hotel by the quadrangle, through the quadrangle, and out into the top of Salisbury Lane. Now, owing to the vastness of the structure of the Grand Babylon, the mere distance thus to be traversed amounted to a little short of 1/4 of a mile, and, as it included a number of stairs, about 24 turnings, and several passages which at that time of night were in darkness more or less complete, Racksole could not have been expected to accomplish the journey in less than 5 minutes. As a matter of fact, 6 minutes had elapsed before he reached the top of Salisbury Lane, because he had been delayed nearly a minute by some questions addressed to him by a muddled and whisky-laden guest who had got lost in the corridors. As everybody knows, there is a sharp, short bend in Salisbury Lane near the top. Racksole ran round this at good racing speed, but he was unfortunate enough to run straight up against the very policeman who had not long before so courteously supplied Jules with a match. The policeman seemed to be scarcely in so pliant a mood just then. "Hullo," he said, his naturally suspicious nature being doubtless aroused by the spectacle of a bareheaded man in evening dress running violently down the lane. "What's this? Where are you for in such a hurry?" And he forcibly detained Theodore Racksole for a moment and scrutinized his face. "Now, officer," said Racksole quietly, "none of your larks, if you please. I've no time to lose." "Beg your pardon, sir," the policeman remarked, though hesitatingly and not quite with good temper, and Racksole was allowed to proceed on his way. The millionaire's scheme for trapping Jules was to get down into the little sunk yard by means of the ladder, and then to secrete himself behind some convenient abutment of brickwork until Mr Tom Jackson should have got into the cellar. He therefore nimbly surmounted the railings of his own hotel, and was gingerly descending the ladder, when lo! a rough hand seized him by the coat collar, and with a ferocious jerk urged him backwards. The fact was, Theodore Racksole had counted without the policeman. That guardian of the peace, mistrusting Racksole's manner, quietly followed him down the lane. The sight of the millionaire climbing the railings had put him on his mettle, and the result was the ignominious capture of Racksole. In vain Theodore expostulated, explained, anathematized. Only one thing would satisfy the stolid policeman, namely that Racksole should return with him to the hotel and there establish his identity. If Racksole then proved to be Racksole, owner of the Grand Babylon, well and good, the policeman promised to apologize. So Theodore had no alternative but to accept the suggestion. To prove his identity was, of course, the work of only a few minutes, after which Racksole, annoyed, but cool as ever, returned to his railings, while the policeman went off to another part of his beat, where he would be likely to meet a comrade and have a chat. In the meantime our friend Jules, sublimely unconscious of the altercation going on outside, and of the special risk which he ran, was of course actually in the cellar, which he had reached before Racksole got to the railings for the first time. It was indeed a happy chance for Jules that his exit from the cellar coincided with the period during which Racksole was absent from the railings. As Racksole came down the lane for the second time, he saw a figure walking about 50 yards in front of him towards the embankment. Instantly he divined that it was Jules, and that the policeman had thrown him just too late. He ran, and Jules, hearing the noise of pursuit, ran also. The ex-waiter was fleet. He made direct for a certain spot in the embankment wall, and, to the intense astonishment of Racksole, jumped clean over the wall, as it seemed, into the river. "Is he so desperate as to commit suicide?" Racksole exclaimed as he rang. But a second later the puff and snort of a steam launch told him that Jules was not quite driven to suicide. As the millionaire crossed the embankment roadway he saw the funnel of the launch move out from under the river wall. It swerved into midstream and headed towards London Bridge. There was a silent mist over the river. Racksole was helpless. Although Racksole had now been twice worsted in a contest of wits within the precincts of the Grand Babylon, once by Rocco and once by Jules, he could not fairly blame himself for the present miscarriage of his plans, a miscarriage due to the meddlesomeness of an extraneous person, combined with pure ill fortune. He did not, therefore, permit the accident to interfere with his sleep that night. On the following day he sought out Prince Aribert, between whom and himself there now existed a feeling of unmistakable, frank friendship, and disclosed to him the happenings of the previous night, and particularly the tampering with a bottle of Romanée Conti. "I believe you dined with Prince Eugen last night?" "I did, and curiously enough we had a bottle of Romanée Conti, an admirable wine, of which Eugen is passionately fond." "And you will dine with him tonight?" "Most probably. Today will, I fear, be our last day here. Eugen wishes to return to Posen early tomorrow." "Has it struck you, Prince," said Racksole, "that if Jules had succeeded in poisoning your nephew, he would probably have succeeded also in poisoning you?" "I had not thought of it," laughed Aribert, "but it would seem so. It appears that so long as he brings down his particular quarry, Jules is careless of anything else that may be accidentally involved in the destruction. However, we need have no fear on that score now. You know the bottle, and you can destroy it at once." "But I do not propose to destroy it," said Racksole calmly. "If Prince Eugen asks for Romanée Conti to be served tonight, as he probably will, I propose that that precise bottle shall be served to him, and to you." "Then you would poison us in spite of ourselves?" "Scarcely," Racksole smiled. "My notion is to discover the accomplices within the hotel. I have already inquired as to the wine clerk, Hubbard. Now, does it not occur to you as extraordinary that on this particular day Mr Hubbard should be ill in bed? Mr Hubbard, I am informed, is suffering from an attack of stomach poisoning, which has supervened during the night. He says that he does not know what can have caused it. His place in the wine cellars will be taken today by his assistant, a mere youth, but to all appearances a fairly smart youth. I need not say that we shall keep an eye on that youth." "One moment," Prince Aribert interrupted. "I do not quite understand how you think the poisoning was to have been effected." "The bottle is now under examination by an expert, who has instructions to remove as little as possible of the stuff which Jules put on the rim of the mouth of it. It will be secretly replaced in its bin during the day. My idea is that by the mere action of pouring out, the wine takes up some of the poison, which I deem to be very strong, and thus becomes fatal as it enters the glass." "But surely the servant in attendance would wipe the mouth of the bottle?" "Very carelessly, perhaps, and moreover he would be extremely unlikely to wipe off all the stuff. Some of it has been ingeniously placed just on the inside edge of the rim. Besides, suppose he forgot to wipe the bottle?" "Prince Eugen is always served at dinner by Hans. It is an honor which the faithful old fellow reserves for himself." "But suppose Hans—" Racksole stopped. "Hans an accomplice? My dear Racksole, the suggestion is wildly impossible." That night Prince Aribert dined with his august nephew in the superb dining room of the royal apartments. Hans served, the dishes being brought to the door by other servants. Aribert found his nephew despondent and taciturn. On the previous day, when, after the futile interview with Sampson Levi, Prince Eugen had despairingly threatened to commit suicide, in such a manner as to make it "look like an accident," Aribert had compelled him to give his word of honor not to do so. "What wine will your Royal Highness take?" asked old Hans in his soothing tones, when the soup was served. "Sherry," was Prince Eugen's curt order. "And Romanée Conti afterwards?" said Hans. Aribert looked up quickly. "No, not tonight. I'll try Sillery tonight," said Prince Eugen. "I think I'll have Romanée Conti, Hans, after all," he said. "It suits me better than champagne." The famous and unsurpassable Burgundy was served with the roast. Old Hans brought it tenderly in its wicker cradle, inserted the corkscrew with mathematical precision, and drew the cork, which he offered for his master's inspection. Eugen nodded, and told him to put it down. Aribert watched with intense interest. He could not for an instant believe that Hans was not the very soul of fidelity, and yet, despite himself, Racksole's words had caused him a certain uneasiness. At that moment Prince Eugen murmured across the table: "Aribert, I withdraw my promise. Observe that, I withdraw it." Aribert shook his head emphatically, without removing his gaze from Hans. The white-haired servant perfunctorily dusted his napkin round the neck of the bottle of Romanée Conti, and poured out a glass. Aribert trembled from head to foot. Eugen took up the glass and held it to the light. "Don't drink it," said Aribert very quietly. "It is poisoned." "Poisoned!" exclaimed Prince Eugen. "Poisoned, sire!" exclaimed old Hans, with an air of profound amazement and concern, and he seized the glass. "Impossible, sire. I myself opened the bottle. No one else has touched it, and the cork was perfect." "I tell you it is poisoned," Aribert repeated. "Your Highness will pardon an old man," said Hans, "but to say that this wine is poison is to say that I am a murderer. I will prove to you that it is not poisoned. I will drink it." And he raised the glass to his trembling lips. In that moment Aribert saw that old Hans, at any rate, was not an accomplice of Jules. Springing up from his seat, he knocked the glass from the aged servitor's hands, and the fragments of it fell with a light tinkling crash partly on the table and partly on the floor. The Prince and the servant gazed at one another in a distressing and terrible silence. There was a slight noise, and Aribert looked aside. He saw that Eugen's body had slipped forward limply over the left arm of his chair. The Prince's arms hung straight and lifeless. His eyes were closed. He was unconscious. "Hans," murmured Aribert. "Hans, what is this?" End of chapter 23 and 24. Chapter 25 and 26 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 25. The Steam Launch. Mr. Tom Jackson's notion of making good his escape from the hotel by means of a steam launch was an excellent one, so far as it went. But Theodore Racksole, for his part, did not consider that it went quite far enough. Theodore Racksole opined, with peculiar glee, that he now had a tangible and definite clue for the catching of the Grand Babylon's ex-waiter. He knew nothing of the port of London, but he happened to know a good deal of the far more complicated, though somewhat smaller, port of New York, and he felt sure there ought to be no extraordinary difficulty in getting hold of Jules' steam launch. To those who are not thoroughly familiar with it, the River Thames and its docks, from London Bridge to Gravesend, seems a vast and uncharted wilderness of craft, a wilderness in which it would be perfectly easy to hide even a three-master successfully. To such people the idea of looking for a steam launch on the river would be about equivalent to the idea of looking for a needle in a bundle of hay. But the fact is, there are hundreds of men between St. Catherine's Wharf and Blackwall who literally know the Thames as the suburban householder knows his back garden, who can recognize thousands of ships and put a name to them at a distance of half a mile, who are informed as to every movement of vessels on the great stream, who know all the captains, all the engineers, all the lightermen, all the pilots, all the licensed watermen, and all the unlicensed scoundrels from the Tower to Gravesend, and a lot further. By these experts of the Thames, the slightest unusual event on the water is noticed and discussed. A wherry cannot change hands, but they will guess shrewdly upon the price paid and the intentions of the new owner with regard to it. They have a habit of watching the river for the mere interest of the sight, and they talk about everything, like housewives gathered of an evening round the cottage door. If the first mate of a castle liner gets the sack, they will be able to tell you what he said to the captain, what the old man said to him, and what both said to the board, and having finished off that affair, they will cheerfully turn to discussing whether Bill Stevens sank his barge outside the West Indian No. 2 by accident or on purpose. Theodore Racksole had no satisfactory means of identifying the steam launch which carried away Mr. Tom Jackson. The sky had clouded over soon after midnight, and there was also a slight mist, and he had only been able to make out that it was a low craft, about 60 feet long, probably painted black. He had personally kept a watch all through the night on vessels going upstream, and during the next morning he had a man to take his place who warned him whenever a steam launch went towards Westminster. At noon, after his conversation with Prince Aribert, he went down the river in a hired rowboat as far as the custom house, and poked about everywhere in search of any vessel which could by any possibility be the one he was in search of. But he found nothing. He was therefore tolerably sure that the mysterious launch lay somewhere below the custom house. At the custom house stairs he landed and asked for a very high official, an official inferior only to a commissioner, whom he had entertained once in New York, and who had met him in London on business at Lloyd's. In the large but dingy office of this great man a long conversation took place, a conversation in which Racksole had to exercise a certain amount of persuasive power, and which ultimately ended in the high official ringing his bell. "Desire Mr. Hazell, room number 332, to speak to me," said the official to the boy who answered the summons, and then, turning to Racksole, "I need hardly repeat, my dear Mr. Racksole, that this is strictly unofficial." "Agreed, of course," said Racksole. Mr. Hazell entered. He was a young man of about 30, dressed in blue serge, with a pale, keen face, a brown moustache, and a rather handsome brown beard. "Mr. Hazell," said the high official, "let me introduce you to Mr. Theodore Racksole. You will doubtless be familiar with his name. Mr. Hazell," he went on to Racksole, "is one of our outdoor staff, what we call an examining officer. Just now he is doing night duty. He has a boat on the river and a couple of men, and the right to board and examine any craft whatever. What Mr. Hazell and his crew don't know about the Thames between here and Gravesend isn't knowledge." "Glad to meet you, sir," said Racksole simply, and they shook hands. Racksole observed with satisfaction that Mr. Hazell was entirely at his ease. "Now, Hazell," the high official continued, "Mr. Racksole wants you to help in a little private expedition on the river tonight. I will give you a night's leave. I sent for you partly because I thought you would enjoy the affair, and partly because I think I can rely on you to regard it as entirely unofficial, and not to talk about it. You understand? I dare say you will have no cause to regret having obliged Mr. Racksole." "I think I grasp the situation," said Hazell, with a slight smile. "And, by the way," added the high official, "although the business is unofficial, it might be well if you wore your official overcoat. See?" "Decidedly," said Hazell. "I should have done so in any case." "And now, Mr. Hazell," said Racksole, Will you do me the pleasure of lunching with me? If you agree, I should like to lunch at the place you usually frequent." So it came to pass that Theodore Racksole and George Hazell, outdoor clerk in the Customs, lunched together at Thomas's chop house in the City of London upon mutton chops and coffee. The millionaire soon discovered that he had got hold of a keen-witted man and a person of much insight. "Tell me," said Hazell, when they had reached the cigarette stage, "are the magazine writers anything like correct?" "What do you mean?" asked Racksole, mystified. "Well, you're a millionaire, one of the best, I believe. One often sees articles on and interviews with millionaires, which describe their private railroad cars, their steam yachts on the Hudson, their marble stables, and so on, and so on. Do you happen to have those things?" "I have a private car on the New York Central, and I have a 2,000-ton schooner yacht, though it isn't on the Hudson. It happens just now to be on East River. And I'm bound to admit that the stables of my uptown place are fitted with marble." "Ah," said Hazell, "now I can believe that I'm lunching with a millionaire. It is strange how facts like those, unimportant in themselves, appeal to the imagination. You seem to me a real millionaire now. You've given me some personal information. I'll give you some in return. I earn £300 a year, and perhaps £60 a year extra for overtime. I live by myself, in 2 rooms in Muscovy Court. I've as much money as I need, and I always do exactly what I like outside office. As regards the office, I do as little work as I can, on principle. It's a fight between us and the commissioners who shall get the best. They try to do us down, and we try to do them down. It's pretty even on the whole. All's fair in war, you know, and there ain't no 10 commandments in a government office." Racksole laughed. "Can you get off this afternoon?" he asked. "Certainly," said Hazell. "I'll get one of my pals to sign on for me, and then I shall be free." "Well," said Racksole, "I should like you to come down with me to the Grand Babylon. Then we can talk over my little affair at length. And may we go on your boat? I want to meet your crew." "That will be all right," Hazell remarked. "My 2 men are the idlest, most soulless chaps you ever saw. They eat too much, and they have an enormous appetite for beer. But they know the river, and they know their business, and they will do anything within the fair game if they're paid for it, and aren't asked to hurry." That night, just after dark, Theodore Racksole embarked with his new friend George Hazell in one of the black-painted customs wherries, manned by a crew of 2 men, both the latter freemen of the river, a distinction which carries with it certain privileges unfamiliar to the mere landsman. It was a cloudy and oppressive evening, not a star showing to illumine the slow tide, now just past its flood. The vast forms of steamers at anchor, chiefly those of the General Steam Navigation and the Aberdeen Line, heaved themselves high out of the water, straining sluggishly at their mooring buoys. On either side the naked walls of warehouses rose like grey precipices from the stream, holding forth quaint arms of steam cranes. To the west the Tower Bridge spanned the river with its formidable arch, and above that its suspended footpath, 150 feet from earth. Down towards the east and the Pool of London, a forest of funnels and masts was dimly outlined against the sinister sky. Huge barges, each steered by a single man at the end of a pair of giant oars, lumbered and swirled downstream at all angles. Occasionally a tug snorted busily past, flashing its red and green signals and dragging an unwieldy tail of barges in its wake. Then a Margate passenger steamer, its electric lights gleaming from every porthole, swerved round to anchor, with its load of 2,000 fatigued excursionists. Over everything brooded an air of mystery, a spirit and feeling of strangeness, remoteness, and the inexplicable. As the broad, flat little boat bobbed its way under the shadow of enormous hulks, beneath stretched hawsers, and past buoys covered with green slime, Racksole could scarcely believe that he was in the very heart of London, the most prosaic city in the world. He had a queer idea that almost anything might happen in this seeming waste of waters at this weird hour of 10 o'clock. It appeared incredible to him that only a mile or 2 away people were sitting in theatres applauding farces, and that at Cannon Street Station, a few yards off, other people were calmly taking the train to various highly respectable suburbs whose names he was gradually learning. He had the uplifting sensation of being in another world, which comes to us sometimes amid surroundings violently different from our usual surroundings. The most ordinary noises, of men calling, of a chain running through a slot, of a distant siren, translated themselves to his ears into terrible and haunting sounds, full of portentous significance. He looked over the side of the boat into the brown water, and asked himself what frightful secrets lay hidden in its depth. Then he put his hand into his hip pocket and touched the stock of his Colt revolver. That familiar substance comforted him. The oarsman had instructions to drop slowly down to the pool, as the wide reach below the tower is called. These two men had not been previously informed of the precise object of the expedition, but now that they were safely afloat, Hazel judged it expedient to give them some notion of it. "We expect to come across a rather suspicious steam launch," he said. "My friend here is very anxious to get a sight of her, and until he has seen her, nothing definite can be done." "What sort of craft is she, sir?" asked the stroke oar, a fat-faced man who seemed absolutely incapable of any serious exertion. "I don't know," Racksole replied, "but as near as I can judge, she's about 60 feet in length, and painted black. I fancy I shall recognize her when I see her." "Not much to go by, that," exclaimed the other man curtly, but he said no more. He, as well as his mate, had received from Theodore Racksole 1 English sovereign as a kind of preliminary fee, and an English sovereign will do a lot towards silencing the natural sarcastic tendencies and free speech of a Thames waterman. "There's one thing I noticed," said Racksole suddenly, "and I forgot to tell you of it, Mr. Hazel. Her screw seemed to move with a rather irregular, lame sort of beat." Both watermen burst into a laugh. "Oh," said the fat rower, "I know what you're after, sir. It's Jack Everett's launch, commonly called Squirm. She's got a 4-bladed propeller, and one blade is broken off short." "Aye, that's it, sure enough," agreed the man in the bows. "And if it's her you want, I seed her lying up against Cherry Gardens Pier this very morning." "Let us go to Cherry Gardens Pier, by all means, as soon as possible," Racksole said, and the boat swung across stream and then began to creep down by the right bank, feeling its way past wharves, many of which, even at that hour, were still busy with their cranes, that descended empty into the bellies of ships and came up full. As the two watermen gingerly manoeuvred the boat on the ebbing tide, Hazel explained to the millionaire that the Squirm was one of the most notorious craft on the river. It appeared that when anyone had a nefarious or underhand scheme afoot, which necessitated river work, Everett's launch was always available for a suitable monetary consideration. The Squirm had got itself into 1,000 scrapes, and out of those scrapes again with safety, if not precisely with honour. The river police kept a watchful eye on it, and the chief marvel about the whole thing was that old Everett, the owner, had never yet been seriously compromised in any illegal escapade. Not once had the officer of the law been able to prove anything definite against the proprietor of the Squirm, though several of its quondam hirers were at that very moment in various of Her Majesty's prisons throughout the country. Latterly, however, the launch, with its damaged propeller, which Everett consistently refused to have repaired, had acquired an evil reputation, even among evil-doers, and this fraternity had gradually come to abandon it for less easily recognizable craft. "Your friend, Mr. Tom Jackson," said Hazel to Racksole, "committed an error of discretion when he hired the Squirm. A scoundrel of his experience and calibre ought certainly to have known better than that. You cannot fail to get a clue now." By this time the boat was approaching Cherry Gardens Pier, but unfortunately a thin night fog had swept over the river, and objects could not be discerned with any clearness beyond a distance of 30 yards. As the customs boat scraped down past the pier, all its occupants strained eyes for a glimpse of the mysterious launch, but nothing could be seen of it. The boat continued to float idly downstream, the men resting on their oars. Then they narrowly escaped bumping a large Norwegian sailing vessel at anchor with her stem pointing downstream. This ship they passed on the port side. Just as they got clear of her bowsprit, the fat man cried out excitedly, "There's her nose!" and he put the boat about and began to pull back against the tide. And surely the missing Squirm was comfortably anchored on the starboard quarter of the Norwegian ship, hidden neatly between the ship and the shore. The men pulled very quietly alongside. Chapter 26. The Night Chase and the Mudlark. "I'll board her to start with," said Hazel, whispering to Racksole. "I'll make out that I suspect they've got dutiable goods on board, and that will give me a chance to have a good look at her." Dressed in his official overcoat and peaked cap, he stepped, rather jauntily as Racksole thought, on to the low deck of the launch. 'Anyone aboard?' Racksole heard him cry out, and a woman's voice answered. 'I'm a customs examining officer, and I want to search the launch,' Hazell shouted, and then disappeared down into the little saloon amidships, and Racksole heard no more. It seemed to the millionaire that Hazell had been gone hours, but at length he returned. 'Can't find anything,' he said, as he jumped into the boat, and then privately to Racksole. 'There's a woman on board. Looks as if she might coincide with your description of Miss Spencer. Steam's up, but there's no engineer. I asked where the engineer was, and she inquired what business that was of mine, and requested me to go through with my own business and clear off. Seems rather a smart sort. I poked my nose into everything, but I saw no sign of anyone else. Perhaps we'd better pull away and lie near for a bit, just to see if anything queer occurs.' 'You're quite sure he isn't on board?' Racksole asked. 'Quite,' said Hazell positively. 'I know how to search a vessel. See this,' and he handed to Racksole a sort of steel skewer about 2 feet long with a wooden handle. 'That,' he said, 'is one of the customs aids to searching.' 'I suppose it wouldn't do to go on board and carry off the lady?' Racksole suggested doubtfully. 'Well,' Hazell began, with equal doubtfulness, 'as for that—' 'Where's he off?' It was the man in the bows who interrupted Hazell. Following the direction of the man's finger, both Hazell and Racksole saw with more or less distinctness a dinghy slip away from the forefoot of the Norwegian vessel and disappear downstream into the mist. 'It's Jules, I'll swear!' cried Racksole. 'After him, men! £10 apiece if we overtake him.' 'Lay down to it now, boys,' said Hazell, and the heavy customs boat shot out in pursuit. 'This is going to be a lark,' Racksole remarked. 'Depends on what you call a lark,' said Hazell. 'It's not much of a lark tearing down midstream like this in a fog. You never know when you mayn't be in Kingdom Come with all these barges knocking around. I expect that chap hid in the dinghy when he first caught sight of us, and then slipped his painter as soon as I'd gone.' The boat was moving at a rapid pace with the tide. Steering was a matter of luck and instinct more than anything else. Every now and then Hazell, who held the lines, was obliged to jerk the boat's head sharply round to avoid a barge or an anchored vessel. It seemed to Racksole that vessels were anchored all over the stream. He looked about him anxiously, but for a long time he could see nothing but mist and vague nautical forms. Then suddenly he said, quietly enough, 'We're on the right road. I can see him ahead. We're gaining on him.' In another minute the dinghy was plainly visible, not 20 yards away, and the sculler, sculling frantically now, was unmistakably Jules. Jules in a light tweed suit and a bowler hat. 'You were right,' Hazell said. 'This is a lark. I believe I'm getting quite excited. It's more exciting than playing the trombone in an orchestra. I'll run him down, eh? And then we can drag the chap in from the water.' Racksole nodded, but at that moment a barge, with a red sail set, stood out of the fog clean across the bows of the customs boat, which narrowly escaped instant destruction. When they got clear, and the usual interchange of calm, nonchalant swearing was over, the dinghy was barely to be discerned in the mist, and the fat man was breathing in such a manner that his sighs might almost have been heard on the banks. Racksole wanted violently to do something, but there was nothing to do, and he could only sit supine by Hazell's side in the stern sheets. Gradually they began again to overtake the dinghy, whose one-man crew was evidently tiring. As they came up, hand over fist, the dinghy's nose swerved aside, and the tiny craft passed down a water lane between 2 anchored mineral barges, which lay black and deserted about 50 yards from the Surrey shore. 'To starboard,' said Racksole. 'No, man,' Hazell replied. 'We can't get through there. He's bound to come out below. It's only a feint. I'll keep our nose straight ahead.' And they went on, the fat man pounding away, with a face which glistened even in the thick gloom. It was an empty dinghy which emerged from between the 2 barges and went drifting and revolving down towards Greenwich. The fat man gasped a word to his comrade, and the customs boat stopped dead. 'He's all right,' said the man in the bows. 'If it's him you want, he's on one of them barges, so you've only got to step on and take him off.' 'That's all,' said a voice out of the depths of the nearest barge, and it was the voice of Jules, otherwise known as Mr Tom Jackson. 'Hear him?' said the fat man, smiling. 'He's a good one, he is. But if I was you, Mr Hazell, or you, sir, I shouldn't step on to that barge so quick as all that.' They backed the boat under the stem of the nearest barge and gazed upwards. "It's all right," said Racksole to Hazel. "I've got a revolver. How can I clamber up there?" "Yes, I dare say you've got a revolver all right," Hazel replied sharply, "but you mustn't use it. There mustn't be any noise. We should have the river police down on us in a twinkling if there was a revolver shot, and it would be the ruin of me. If an inquiry was held, the commissioners wouldn't take any official notice of the fact that my superior officer had put me on to this job, and I should be requested to leave the service." "Have no fear on that score," said Racksole. "I shall, of course, take all responsibility." "It wouldn't matter how much responsibility you took," Hazel retorted. "You wouldn't put me back into the service, and my career would be at an end." "But there are other careers," said Racksole, who was really anxious to lame his ex-waiter by means of a judiciously aimed bullet. "There are other careers." "The Customs is my career," said Hazel, "so let's have no shooting. We'll wait about a bit. He can't escape. You can have my skewer if you like," and he gave Racksole his searching instrument. "And you can do what you please, provided you do it neatly and don't make a row over it." For a few moments the four men were passive in the boat, surrounded by swirling mist, with black water beneath them and towering above them a half-loaded barge with a desperate and resourceful man on board. Suddenly the mist parted and shrivelled away in patches, as though before the breath of some monster. The sky was visible. It was a clear sky, and the moon was shining. The transformation was just one of those meteorological quick changes which happen most frequently on a great river. "That's a sight better," said the fat man. At the same moment a head appeared over the edge of the barge. It was Jules' face, dark, sinister, and leering. "Is it Mr Racksole in that boat?" he inquired calmly. "Because if so, let Mr Racksole step up. Mr Racksole has caught me, and he can have me for the asking. Here I am." He stood up to his full height on the barge, tall against the night sky, and all the occupants of the boat could see that he held firmly clasped in his right hand a short dagger. "Now, Mr Racksole, you've been after me for a long time," he continued. "Here I am. Why don't you step up? If you haven't got the pluck yourself, persuade someone else to step up in your place. The same fair treatment will be accorded to all." And Jules laughed a low, penetrating laugh. He was in the midst of this laugh when he lurched suddenly forward. "What are you doing off aboard my barge? Off you goes!" It was a boy's small shrill voice that sounded in the night. A ragged boy's small form had appeared silently behind Jules, and two small arms with a vicious shove precipitated him into the water. He fell with a fine gurgling splash. It was at once obvious that swimming was not among Jules' accomplishments. He floundered wildly and sank. When he reappeared he was dragged into the Customs boat. Rope was produced, and in a minute or two the man lay ignominiously bound in the bottom of the boat. With the aid of a mudlark, a mere barge boy who probably had no more right on the barge than Jules himself, Racksole had won his game. For the first time for several weeks the millionaire experienced the sensation of equanimity and satisfaction. He leaned over the prostrate form of Jules, Hazel's professional skewer in his hand. "What are you going to do with him now?" asked Hazel. "We'll row up to the landing steps in front of the Grand Babylon. He shall be well lodged at my hotel, I promise him." Jules spoke no word. Before Racksole parted company with the Customs man that night, Jules had been safely transported into the Grand Babylon Hotel, and the two watermen had received their £10 apiece. "You will sleep here?" said the millionaire to Mr George Hazel. "It is late." "With pleasure," said Hazel. The next morning he found a sumptuous breakfast awaiting him, and in his table napkin was a Bank of England note for £100. But, though he did not hear of them till much later, many things had happened before Hazel consumed that sumptuous breakfast. End of chapter 25 and 26. Chapter 27 and 28 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 27. The Confession of Mr. Tom Jackson. It happened that the small bedroom occupied by Jules during the years he was head waiter at the Grand Babylon had remained empty since his sudden dismissal by Theodore Racksole. No other head waiter had been formally appointed in his place, and, indeed, the absence of one man, even the unique Jules, could scarcely have been noticed in the enormous staff of a place like the Grand Babylon. The functions of a head waiter are generally more ornamental, spectacular, and morally impressive than useful, and it was so at the great hotel on the Embankment. Racksole accordingly had the excellent idea of transporting his prisoner, with as much secrecy as possible, to this empty bedroom. There proved to be no difficulty in doing so. Jules showed himself perfectly amenable to a show of superior force. Racksole took upstairs with him an old commissionaire who had been attached to the outdoor service of the hotel for many years, a grey-haired man, wiry as a terrier and strong as a mastiff. Entering the bedroom with Jules, whose hands were bound, he told the commissionaire to remain outside the door. Jules' bedroom was quite an ordinary apartment, though perhaps slightly superior to the usual accommodation provided for servants in the caravanserais of the West End. It was about 14 by 12. It was furnished with a bedstead, a small wardrobe, a small washstand and dressing table, and 2 chairs. There were 2 hooks behind the door, a strip of carpet by the bed, and some cheap ornaments on the iron mantelpiece. There was also 1 electric light. The window was a little square one, high up from the floor, and it looked on the inner quadrangle. The room was on the top story, the 8th, and from it you had a view sheer to the ground. 20 feet below ran a narrow cornice about a foot wide. 3 feet or so above the window another and wider cornice jutted out, and above that was the high steep roof of the hotel, though you could not see it from the window. As Racksole examined the window and the outlook, he said to himself that Jules could not escape by that exit, at any rate. He gave a glance up the chimney and saw that the flue was far too small to admit a man's body. Then he called in the commissionaire, and together they bound Jules firmly to the bedstead, allowing him, however, to lie down. All the while the captive never opened his mouth, merely smiled a smile of disdain. Finally Racksole removed the ornaments, the carpet, the chairs and the hooks, and wrenched away the switch of the electric light. Then he and the commissionaire left the room, and Racksole locked the door on the outside and put the key in his pocket. "You will keep watch here," he said to the commissionaire, "through the night. You can sit on this chair. Don't go to sleep. If you hear the slightest noise in the room, blow your cab whistle. I will arrange to answer the signal. If there is no noise, do nothing whatever. I don't want this talked about, you understand? I shall trust you. You can trust me." "But the servants will see me here when they get up tomorrow," said the commissionaire, with a faint smile, "and they will be pretty certain to ask what I am doing of up here. What shall I say to them?" "You've been a soldier, haven't you?" asked Racksole. "I have seen 3 campaigns, sir," was the reply, and, with a gesture of pardonable pride, the grey-haired fellow pointed to the medals on his breast. "Well, supposing you were on sentry duty and some meddlesome person in camp asked you what you were doing, what should you say?" "I should tell him to clear off or take the consequences, and pretty quick too." "Do that tomorrow morning then, if necessary," said Racksole, and departed. It was then about 1 o'clock a.m. The millionaire retired to bed, not his own bed, but a bed on the 7th story. He did not, however, sleep very long. Shortly after dawn he was wide awake and thinking busily about Jules. He was, indeed, very curious to know Jules' story, and he determined, if the thing could be done at all, by persuasion or otherwise, to extract it from him. With a man of Theodore Racksole's temperament there is no time like the present, and at 6 o'clock, as the bright morning sun brought gaiety into the window, he dressed and went upstairs again to the 8th story. The commissionaire sat stolid but alert on his chair, and, at the sight of his master, rose and saluted. "Anything happened?" Racksole asked. "Nothing, sir." "Servants say anything?" "Only a dozen or so of 'em are up yet, sir. One of 'em asked what I was playing at, and so I told her I was looking after a bull bitch and a litter of pups that you was very particular about, sir." "Good," said Racksole, as he unlocked the door and entered the room. All was exactly as he had left it, except that Jules, who had been lying on his back, had somehow turned over and was now lying on his face. He gazed silently, scowling at the millionaire. Racksole greeted him and ostentatiously took a revolver from his hip pocket and laid it on the dressing table. Then he seated himself on the dressing table by the side of the revolver, his legs dangling an inch or 2 above the floor. "I want to have a talk to you, Jackson," he began. "You can talk to me as much as you like," said Jules. "I shan't interfere. You may bet on that. I should like you to answer some questions. That's different, said Jules. I'm not going to answer any questions while I'm tied up like this. You may bet on that too. It will pay you to be reasonable, said Racksole. I'm not going to answer any questions while I'm tied up. I'll unfasten your legs, if you like, Racksole suggested politely. Then you can sit up. It's no use you pretending you've been uncomfortable, because I know you haven't. I calculate you've been treated very handsomely, my son. There you are. And he loosened the lower extremities of his prisoner from their bonds. Now I repeat, you may as well be reasonable. You may as well admit that you've been fairly beaten in the game, and act accordingly. I was determined to beat you, by myself, without the police, and I've done it. You've done yourself, retorted Jules. You've gone against the law. If you'd had any sense, you wouldn't have meddled. You'd have left everything to the police. They'd have muddled about for a year or two, and then done nothing. Who's going to tell the police now? Are you? Are you going to give me up to 'em and say, "Here, I've caught him for you"? If you do, they'll ask you to explain several things, and then you'll look foolish. One crime doesn't excuse another, and you'll find that out. With unerring insight, Jules had perceived exactly the difficulty of Racksole's position, and it was certainly a difficulty which Racksole did not attempt to minimize to himself. He knew well that it would have to be faced. He did not, however, allow Jules to guess his thoughts. Meanwhile, he said calmly to the other, you're here and my prisoner. You've committed a variegated assortment of crimes, and among them is murder. You're due to be hung. You know that. There is no reason why I should call in the police at all. It will be perfectly easy for me to finish you off, as you deserve, myself. I shall only be carrying out justice and robbing the hangman of his fee. Precisely as I brought you into the hotel, I can take you out again. A few days ago you borrowed or stole a steam yacht at Ostend. What you have done with it I don't know, nor do I care, but I strongly suspect that my daughter had a narrow escape of being murdered on your steam yacht. Now I have a steam yacht of my own. Suppose I use it as you used yours. Suppose I smuggle you onto it, steam out to sea, and then ask you to step off it into the ocean one night. Such things have been done. Such things will be done again. If I acted so, I should at least have the satisfaction of knowing that I had relieved society from the incubus of a scoundrel. But you won't, Jules murmured. No, said Racksole steadily, I won't, if you behave yourself this morning. But I swear to you that if you don't, I will never rest till you're dead, police or no police. You don't know Theodore Racksole. I believe you mean it, Jules exclaimed, with an air of surprised interest, as though he discovered something of importance. I believe I do, Racksole resumed. Now listen. At the best you will be given up to the police. At the worst I shall deal with you myself. With the police you may have a chance. You may get off with 20 years penal servitude, because, though it is absolutely certain that you murdered Reginald Dimmock, it would be a little difficult to prove the case against you. But with me you would have no chance whatever. I have a few questions to put to you, and it will depend on how you answer them whether I give you up to the police or take the law into my own hands. And let me tell you that the latter course would be much simpler for me. And I would take it too, did I not feel that you were a very clever and exceptional man. Did I not have a sort of sneaking admiration for your detestable skill and ingenuity. You think, then, that I am clever, said Jules. You are right, I am. I should have been much too clever for you if luck had not been against me. You owe your victory not to skill, but to luck. That is what the vanquished always say. Waterloo was a bit of pure luck for the English, no doubt, but it was Waterloo all the same. Jules yawned elaborately. What do you want to know? He inquired, with politeness. First and foremost, I want to know the names of your accomplices inside this hotel. I have no more, said Jules. Rocco was the last. Don't begin by lying to me. If you had no accomplice, how did you contrive that one particular bottle of Romanée Conti should be served to His Highness Prince Eugen? Then you discovered that in time, did you? Said Jules. I was afraid so. Let me explain that needed no accomplice. The bottle was topmost in the bin, and naturally it would be taken. Moreover, I left it sticking out a little further than the rest.' 'You did not arrange, then, that Hubbard should be taken ill the night before last?' 'I had no idea,' said Jules, 'that the excellent Hubbard was not enjoying his accustomed health.' 'Tell me,' said Racksole, 'who or what is the origin of your vendetta against the life of Prince Eugen?' 'I had no vendetta against the life of Prince Eugen,' said Jules, 'at least, not to begin with. I merely undertook, for a consideration, to see that Prince Eugen did not have an interview with a certain Mr Sampson Levi in London before a certain date, that was all. It seemed simple enough. I had been engaged in far more complicated transactions before. I was convinced that I could manage it, with the help of Rocco and Miss Spencer.' 'Is that woman your wife?' 'She would like to be,' he sneered. 'Please don't interrupt. I had completed my arrangements when you so inconsiderately bought the hotel. I don't mind admitting now that from the very moment when you came across me that night in the corridor I was secretly afraid of you, though I scarcely admitted the fact even to myself then. I thought it safer to shift the scene of our operations to Ostend. I had meant to deal with Prince Eugen in this hotel, but I decided then to intercept him on the Continent, and I dispatched Miss Spencer with some instructions. Troubles never come singly, and it happened that just then that fool Dimmock, who had been in the swim with us, chose to prove refractory. The slightest hitch would have upset everything, and I was obliged to clear him off the scene. He wanted to back out. He had a bad attack of conscience, and violent measures were essential. I regret his untimely decease, but he brought it on himself. Well, everything was going serenely when you and your brilliant daughter, apparently determined to meddle, turned up again among us at Ostend. Only 24 hours, however, had to elapse before the date which had been mentioned to me by my employers. I kept poor little Eugen for the allotted time, and then you managed to get hold of him. I do not deny that you scored there, though, according to my original instructions, you scored too late. The time had passed, and so far as I knew, it didn't matter a pin whether Prince Eugen saw Mr Sampson Levi or not. But my employers were still uneasy. They were uneasy even after little Eugen had lain ill in Ostend for several weeks. It appears that they feared that even at that date an interview between Prince Eugen and Mr Sampson Levi might work harm to them. So they applied to me again. This time they wanted Prince Eugen to be finished off entirely. They offered high terms.' 'What terms?' 'I had received £50,000 for the first job, of which Rocco had half. Rocco was also to be made a member of a certain famous European order, if things went right. That was what he coveted far more than the money, the vain fellow. For the second job I was offered 100,000, a tolerably large sum. I regret that I have not been able to earn it.' 'Do you mean to tell me,' asked Racksole, horror struck by this calm confession, in spite of his previous knowledge, 'that you were offered 100,000 to poison Prince Eugen?' 'You put it rather crudely,' said Jules in reply. 'I prefer to say that I was offered 100,000 if Prince Eugen should die within a reasonable time.' 'And who were your damnable employers?' 'That, honestly, I do not know.' 'You know, I suppose, who paid you the first 50,000 and who promised you the 100,000?' 'Well,' said Jules, 'I know vaguely. I know that he came via Vienna from Bosnia. My impression was that the affair had some bearing, direct or indirect, on the projected marriage of the King of Bosnia. He is a young monarch, scarcely out of political leading strings, as it were, and doubtless his ministers thought that they had better arrange his marriage for him. They tried last year, and failed because the princess whom they had in mind had cast her sparkling eyes on another prince. That prince happened to be Prince Eugen of Posen. The ministers of the King of Bosnia knew exactly the circumstances of Prince Eugen. They knew that he could not marry without liquidating his debts, and they knew that he could only liquidate his debts through this Jew, Sampson Levi. Unfortunately for me, they ultimately wanted to make too sure of Prince Eugen. They were afraid he might after all arrange his marriage without the aid of Mr Sampson Levi, and so, well, you know the rest. It is a pity that the poor little innocent king of Bosnia can't have the princess of his minister's choice.' 'Then you think that the king himself had no part in this abominable crime?' 'I think decidedly not.' 'I am glad of that,' said Racksole simply. 'And now the name of your immediate employer.' 'He was merely an agent. He called himself Slezak, Slezak. But I imagine that wasn't his real name. I don't know his real name. An old man, he often used to be found at the Hotel Ritz, Paris.' 'Mr Slezak and I will meet,' said Racksole. 'Not in this world,' said Jules quickly. 'He is dead. I heard only last night, just before our little tussle.' There was a silence. 'It is well,' said Racksole at length. 'Prince Eugen lives, despite all plots. After all, justice is done.' 'Mr Racksole is here, but he can see no one, miss.' The words came from behind the door, and the voice was the commissionnaire's. Racksole started up and went towards the door. 'Nonsense,' was the curt reply, in feminine tones. 'Move aside instantly.' The door opened and Nella entered. There were tears in her eyes. 'Oh, Dad!' she exclaimed, 'I've only just heard you were in the hotel. We looked for you everywhere. Come at once. Prince Eugen is dying.' Then she saw the man sitting on the bed, and stopped. Later, when Jules was alone again, he remarked to himself, 'I may get that 100,000. Chapter 28. The State Bedroom Once More. When, immediately after the episode of the bottle of Romanée Conti in the State dining room, Prince Aribert and old Hans found that Prince Eugen had sunk in an unconscious heap over his chair, both the former thought at the first instant that Eugen must have already tasted the poisoned wine. But a moment's reflection showed that this was not possible. If the hereditary Prince of Posen was dying or dead, his condition was due to some other agency than the Romanée Conti. Aribert bent over him, and a powerful odour from the man's lips at once disclosed the cause of the disaster. It was the odour of laudanum. Indeed, the smell of that sinister drug seemed now to float heavily over the whole table. Across Aribert's mind there flashed then the true explanation. Prince Eugen, taking advantage of Aribert's attention being momentarily diverted, and yielding to a sudden impulse of despair, had decided to poison himself, and had carried out his intention on the spot. The laudanum must have been already in his pocket, and this fact went to prove that the unfortunate Prince had previously contemplated such a proceeding, even after his definite promise. Aribert remembered now with painful vividness his nephew's words. 'I withdraw my promise. Observe that. I withdraw it.' It must have been instantly after the utterance of that formal withdrawal that Eugen attempted to destroy himself. 'It's laudanum, Hans,' Aribert exclaimed, rather helplessly. 'Surely his Highness has not taken poison,' said Hans. 'It is impossible.' 'I fear it is only too possible,' said the other. 'It's laudanum. What are we to do? Quick, man!' 'His Highness must be roused, Prince. He must have an emetic. We had better carry him to the bedroom.' They did, and laid him on the great bed. And then Aribert mixed an emetic of mustard and water, and administered it, but without any effect. The sufferer lay motionless, with every muscle relaxed. His skin was ice cold to the touch, and the eyelids, half drawn, showed that the pupils were painfully contracted. 'Go out and send for a doctor, Hans. Say that Prince Eugen has been suddenly taken ill, but that it isn't serious. The truth must never be known.' 'He must be roused, sire,' Hans said again, as he hurried from the room. Aribert lifted his nephew from the bed, shook him, pinched him, flicked him cruelly, shouted at him, dragged him about, but to no avail. At length he desisted, from mere physical fatigue, and laid the Prince back again on the bed. Every minute that elapsed seemed an hour. Alone with the unconscious organism in the silence of the great stately chamber, under the cold yellow glare of the electric lights, Aribert became a prey to the most despairing thoughts. The tragedy of his nephew's career forced itself upon him, and it occurred to him that an early and shameful death had all along been inevitable for this good-natured, weak-purposed, unhappy child of a historic throne. A little good fortune and his character, so evenly balanced between right and wrong, might have followed the proper path, and Eugen might have figured at any rate with dignity on the European stage. But now it appeared that all was over, the last stroke played. And in this disaster Aribert saw the ruin of his own hopes. For Aribert would have to occupy his nephew's throne, and he felt instinctively that nature had not cut him out for a throne. By a natural impulse he inwardly rebelled against the prospect of monarchy. Monarchy meant so much for which he knew himself to be entirely unfitted. It meant a political marriage, which means a forced marriage, a union against inclination. And then, what of Nella? Nella! Hans returned. "I have sent for the nearest doctor, and also for a specialist," he said. "Good," said Aribert. "I hope they will hurry." Then he sat down and wrote a card. "Take this yourself to Miss Racksole. If she is out of the hotel, ascertain where she is and follow her. Understand, it is of the first importance." Hans bowed and departed for the second time, and Aribert was alone again. He gazed at Eugen and made another frantic attempt to rouse him from the deadly stupor, but it was useless. He walked away to the window. Through the opened casement he could hear the tinkle of passing hansoms on the embankment below, whistles of doorkeepers, and the hoot of steam tugs on the river. The world went on as usual, it appeared. It was an absurd world. He desired nothing better than to abandon his princely title and live as a plain man, the husband of the finest woman on earth. But now... Pah! How selfish he was, to be thinking of himself when Eugen lay dying. Yet... Nella... The door opened, and a man entered, who was obviously the doctor. A few curt questions, and he had grasped the essentials of the case. "Oblige me by ringing the bell, Prince. I shall want some hot water and an able-bodied man and a nurse." "Who wants a nurse?" said a voice, and Nella came quietly in. "I am a nurse," she added to the doctor, "and at your orders." The next 2 hours were a struggle between life and death. The first doctor, a specialist who followed him, Nella, Prince Aribert, and old Hans formed, as it were, a league to save the dying man. None else in the hotel knew the real seriousness of the case. When a prince falls ill, and especially by his own act, the precise truth is not issued broadcast to the universe. According to official intelligence, a prince is never seriously ill until he is dead. Such is statecraft. The worst feature of Prince Eugen's case was that emetics proved futile. Neither of the doctors could explain their failure, but it was only too apparent. The league was reduced to helplessness. At last the great specialist from Manchester Square gave it out that there was no chance for Prince Eugen unless the natural vigour of his constitution should prove capable of throwing off the poison unaided by scientific assistance, as a drunkard can sleep off his potion. Everything had been tried, even to artificial respiration and the injection of hot coffee. Having emitted this pronouncement, the great specialist from Manchester Square left. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. By one of those strange and futile coincidences which sometimes startle us by their subtle significance, the specialist met Theodore Racksole and his captive as they were entering the hotel. Neither had the least suspicion of the other's business. In the state bedroom the small group of watchers surrounded the bed. The slow minutes filed away in dreary procession. Another hour passed. Then the figure on the bed, hitherto so motionless, twitched and moved. The lips parted. "There is hope," said the doctor, and administered a stimulant which was handed to him by Nella. In a quarter of an hour the patient had regained consciousness. For the 10,000th time in the history of medicine, a sound constitution had accomplished a miracle impossible to the accumulated medical skill of centuries. In due course the doctor left, saying that Prince Eugen was on the high road to recovery, and promising to come again within a few hours. Morning had dawned. Nella drew the great curtains and let in a flood of sunlight. Old Hans, overcome by fatigue, dozed in a chair in a far corner of the room. The reaction had been too much for him. Nella and Prince Aribert looked at each other. They had not exchanged a word about themselves, yet each knew what the other had been thinking. They clasped hands with a perfect understanding. Their brief love-making had been of the silent kind, and it was silent now. No word was uttered. A shadow had passed from over them, but only their eyes expressed relief and joy. "Aribert!" The faint call came from the bed. Aribert went to the bedside, while Nella remained near the window. "What is it, Eugen?" he said. "You are better now." "You think so?" murmured the other. "I want you to forgive me for all this, Aribert. I must have caused you an intolerable trouble. I did it so clumsily, that is what annoys me. Laudanum was a feeble expedient, but I could think of nothing else, and I daren't ask anyone for advice. I was obliged to go out and buy the stuff for myself. It was all very awkward. But thank goodness it has not been ineffectual." "What do you mean, Eugen? You are better. In a day or so you will be perfectly recovered." "I am dying," said Eugen quietly. "Do not be deceived. I die because I wish to die. It is bound to be so. I know by the feel of my heart. In a few hours it will be over. The throne of Posen will be yours, Aribert. You will fill it more worthily than I have done. Don't let them know over there that I poisoned myself. Swear Hans to secrecy, swear the doctors to secrecy, and breathe no word yourself. I have been a fool, but I do not wish it to be known that I was also a coward. Perhaps it is not cowardice. Perhaps it is courage, after all. Courage to cut the knot. I could not have survived the disgrace of any revelations, Aribert, and revelations would have been sure to come. I have made a fool of myself, but I am ready to pay for it. We of Posen, we always pay. Everything except our debts. Ah, those debts! Had it not been for those, I could have faced her who was to have been my wife, to have shared my throne. I could have hidden my past and begun again. With her help I really could have begun again. But fate has been against me, always, always. By the way, what was that plot against me, Aribert? I forget. His eyes closed. There was a sudden noise. Old Hans had slipped from his chair to the floor. He picked himself up, dazed, and crept shamefacedly out of the room. Aribert took his nephew's hand. "Nonsense, Eugen. You're dreaming. You will be all right soon. Pull yourself together." "All because of 1,000,000," the sick man moaned. 1 miserable 1,000,000 English pounds. The national debt of Posen is 50 millions, and I, the Prince of Posen, couldn't borrow 1. If I could have got it, I might have held my head up again. Good-bye, Aribert. Who is that girl?" Aribert looked up. Nella was standing silent at the foot of the bed, her eyes moist. She came round to the bedside and put her hand on the patient's heart. Scarcely could she feel its pulsation, and to Aribert her eyes expressed a sudden despair. At that moment Hans re-entered the room and beckoned to her. "I've heard that Herr Racksole has returned to the hotel," he whispered, "and that he has captured that man Jules, who they say is such a villain." Several times during the night Nella inquired for her father, but could gain no knowledge of his whereabouts. Now, at 6:30 in the morning, a rumour had mysteriously spread among the servants of the hotel about the happenings of the night before. How it had originated no one could have determined, but it had originated. "Where is my father?" Nella asked of Hans. He shrugged his shoulders and pointed upwards. "Somewhere at the top, they say." Nella almost ran out of the room. Her interruption of the interview between Jules and Theodore Racksole has already been described. As she came downstairs with her father, she said again, "Prince Eugen is dying, but I think you can save him." "I?" exclaimed Theodore. "Yes," she repeated positively. "I will tell you what I want you to do, and you must do it." End of chapter 27 and 28. Chapter 29 and 30 of the Grand Babylon Hotel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold BENNETT. Chapter 29. Theodore is called to the rescue. As Nella passed downstairs from the top story with her father, the lifts had not yet begun to work, she drew him into her own room and closed the door. "What's this all about?" he asked, somewhat mystified, and even alarmed by the extreme seriousness of her face. "Dad," the girl began, "you are very rich, aren't you? Very, very rich?" She smiled anxiously, timidly. He did not remember to have seen that expression on her face before. He wanted to make a facetious reply, but checked himself. "Yes," he said, "I am. You ought to know that by this time." "How soon could you realize £1,000,000?" "1,000,000! What?" he cried. Even he was staggered by her calm reference to this gigantic sum. "What on earth are you driving at?" £1,000,000, I said. That is to say, $5,000,000. How soon could you realize as much as that?" "Oh," he answered, "in about a month if I went about it neatly enough. I could unload as much as that in a month without scaring Wall Street and other places. But it would want some arrangement." "Useless!" she exclaimed. "Couldn't you do it quicker, if you really had to?" "If I really had to, I could fix it in a week, but it would make things lively, and I should lose on the job." "Couldn't you," she persisted, "couldn't you go down this morning and raise 1,000,000, somehow, if it was a matter of life and death?" He hesitated. "Look here, Nella," he said, "what is it you've got up your sleeve?" "Just answer my question, Dad, and try not to think that I'm a stark, staring lunatic." "I rather expect I could get 1,000,000 this morning, even in London. But it would cost pretty dear. It might cost me £50,000, and there would be the dickens of an upset in New York, a sort of grand universal slump in my holdings." "Why should New York know anything about it?" "Why should New York know anything about it?" he repeated. "My girl, when anyone borrows 1,000,000 sovereigns, the whole world knows about it. Do you reckon that I can go up to the Governor of the Bank of England and say, 'Look here, lend Theodore Racksole 1,000,000 for a few weeks, and he'll give you an IOU and a covering note on stocks'?" "But you could get it?" she asked again. "If there's 1,000,000 in London, I guess I could handle it," he replied. "Well, Dad," and she put her arms round his neck, "you've just got to go out and fix it. See? It's for me. I've never asked you for anything really big before, but I do now, and I want it so badly." He stared at her. "I award you the prize," he said at length. "You deserve it for colossal and immense coolness. Now you can tell me the true inward meaning of all this rigmarole. What is it?" "I want it for Prince Eugen," she began, at first hesitatingly, with pauses. "He's ruined, unless he can get 1,000,000 to pay off his debts. He's dreadfully in love with a princess, and he can't marry her because of this. Her parents wouldn't allow it. He was to have got it from Sampson Levi, but he arrived too late, owing to Jules. I know all about that, perhaps more than you do, but I don't see how it affects you or me." "The point is this, Dad," Nella continued. "He's tried to commit suicide. He's so hipped. Yes, real suicide. He took laudanum last night. It didn't kill him straight off. He's got over the first shock, but he's in a very weak state, and he means to die. And I truly believe he will die. Now, if you could let him have that 1,000,000, Dad, you would save his life." Nella's item of news was a considerable and disconcerting surprise to Racksole, but he hid his feelings fairly well. "I haven't the least desire to save his life, Nell. I don't overmuch respect your Prince Eugen. I've done what I could for him, but only for the sake of seeing fair play, and because I object to conspiracies and secret murders. It's a different thing if he wants to kill himself. What I say is, let him. Who is responsible for his being in debt to the tune of £1,000,000? He's only got himself and his bad habits to thank for that. I suppose if he does happen to peg out, the throne of Posen will go to Prince Aribert, and a good thing too. Aribert is worth 20 of his nephew." "That's just it, Dad," she said, eagerly following up her chance. "I want you to save Prince Eugen just because Prince Aribert, doesn't wish to occupy the throne. He'd much prefer not to have it. Much prefer not to have it? Don't talk nonsense. If he's honest with himself, he'll admit that he'll be jolly glad to have it. Thrones are in his blood, so to speak. You are wrong, father, and the reason is this. If Prince Aribert ascended the throne of Posen, he would be compelled to marry a princess. Well, a prince ought to marry a princess. But he doesn't want to. He wants to give up all his royal rights and live as a subject. He wants to marry a woman who isn't a princess. Is she rich? Her father is, said the girl. Oh, Dad, can't you guess? He loves me. Her head fell on Theodore's shoulder and she began to cry. The millionaire whistled a very high note. Nell, he said at length. And you? Do you sort of cling to him? Dad, she answered, you are stupid. Do you imagine I should worry myself like this if I didn't? She smiled through her tears. She knew from her father's tone that she had accomplished a victory. It's a mighty queer arrangement, Theodore remarked. But of course, if you think it'll be of any use, you'd better go down and tell your Prince Eugen that that million can be fixed up, if he really needs it. I expect there'll be decent security, or Sampson Levi wouldn't have mixed himself up in it. Thanks, Dad. Don't come with me. I may manage better alone. She gave a formal little curtsy and disappeared. Racksole, who had the talent, so necessary to millionaires, of attending to several matters at once, the large with the small, went off to give orders about the breakfast and the remuneration of his assistant of the evening before, Mr. George Hazel. He then sent an invitation to Mr. Felix Babylon's room, asking that gentleman to take breakfast with him. After he had related to Babylon the history of Jules' capture, and had a long discussion with him upon several points of hotel management, and especially as to the guarding of wine cellars, Racksole put on his hat, sallied forth into the Strand, hailed a hansom, and was driven to the city. The order and nature of his operations there were too complex and technical to be described here. When Nella returned to the state bedroom, both the doctor and the great specialist were again in attendance. The two physicians moved away from the bedside as she entered, and began to talk quietly together in the embrasure of the window. "A curious case," said the specialist. "Yes, of course, as you say, it's a neurotic temperament that's at the bottom of the trouble. When you've got that and a vigorous constitution working one against the other, the results are apt to be distinctly curious. Do you consider there is any hope, Sir Charles?" "If I had seen him when he recovered consciousness, I should have said there was hope. Frankly, when I left last night, or rather this morning, I didn't expect to see the Prince alive again, let alone conscious and able to talk. According to all the rules of the game, he ought to get over the shock to the system with perfect ease and certainty. But I don't think he will. I don't think he wants to. And moreover, I think he is still under the influence of suicidal mania. If he had a razor, he would cut his throat. You must keep his strength up. Inject, if necessary. I will come in this afternoon. I am due now at St. James's Palace." And the specialist hurried away, with an elaborate bow and a few hasty words of polite reassurances to Prince Aribert. When he had gone, Prince Aribert took the other doctor aside. "Forget everything, doctor," he said, "except that I am one man and you are another, and tell me the truth. Shall you be able to save his Highness? Tell me the truth." "There is no truth," was the doctor's reply. "The future is not in our hands, Prince." "But you are hopeful, yes or no?" The doctor looked at Prince Aribert. "No," he said shortly, "I am not. I am never hopeful when the patient is not on my side." "You mean?" "I mean that his Royal Highness has no desire to live. You must have observed that." "Only too well," said Aribert. "And you are aware of the cause?" Aribert nodded an affirmative. "But cannot remove it?" "No," said Aribert. He felt a touch on his sleeve. It was Nella's finger. With a gesture she beckoned him towards the anteroom. "If you choose," she said when they were alone, "Prince Eugen can be saved. I have arranged it." "You have arranged it?" He bent over her, almost with an air of alarm. "Go and tell him that the £1,000,000 which is so necessary to his happiness will be forthcoming. Tell him that it will be forthcoming to day, if that will be any satisfaction to him." "But what do you mean by this, Nella?" "I mean what I say, Aribert," and she sought his hand and took it in hers. "Just what I say. If £1,000,000 will save Prince Eugen's life, it is at his disposal." "But how have you managed it? By what miracle?" "My father," she replied softly, "will do anything that I ask him. Do not let us waste time. Go, and tell Eugen it is arranged, that all will be well. Go." "But we cannot accept this enormous, this incredible favour. It is impossible." "Aribert," she said quickly, "remember you are not in Posen holding a court reception. You are in England, and you are talking to an American girl who has always been in the habit of having her own way." The Prince threw up his hands and went back into the bedroom. The doctor was at a table writing out a prescription. Aribert approached the bedside, his heart beating furiously. Eugen greeted him with a faint, fatigued smile. "Eugen," he whispered, "listen carefully to me. I have news. With the assistance of friends I have arranged to borrow that million for you. It is quite settled, and you may rely on it. But you must get better. Do you hear me?" Eugen almost sat up in bed. "Tell me I'm not delirious!" he exclaimed. "Of course you aren't," Aribert replied. "But you mustn't sit up. You must take care of yourself." "Who will lend the money?" Eugen asked in a feeble, happy whisper. "Never mind, you shall hear later. Devote yourself now to getting better." The change in the patient's face was extraordinary. His mind seemed to have put on an entirely different aspect. The doctor was startled to hear him murmur a request for food. As for Aribert, he sat down, overcome by the turmoil of his own thoughts. Till that moment he felt that he had never appreciated the value and the marvellous power of mere money, of the lucre which philosophers pretend to despise and men sell their souls for. His heart almost burst in its admiration for that extraordinary Nella, who by mere personal force had raised two men out of the deepest slough of despair to the blissful heights of hope and happiness. "These Anglo-Saxons," he said to himself, "what a race!" By the afternoon Eugen was noticeably and distinctly better. The physicians, puzzled for the third time by the progress of the case, announced now that all danger was past. The tone of the announcement seemed to Aribert to imply that the fortunate issue was due wholly to unrivalled medical skill, but perhaps Aribert was mistaken. Anyhow, he was in a most charitable mood and prepared to forgive anything. "Nella," he said a little later, when they were by themselves again in the antechamber, "what am I to say to you? How can I thank you? How can I thank your father?" "You had better not thank my father," she said. "Dad will affect to regard the thing as a purely business transaction, as of course it is. As for me, you can "Well?" "Kiss me," she said. "There! Are you sure you formally proposed to me, mon prince?" "Ah, Nell!" he exclaimed, putting his arms round her again. "Be mine. That is all I want." "You'll find," she said, "that you'll want Dad's consent too." "Will he make difficulties?" "He could not, Nell. Not with you." "Better ask him," she said sweetly. A moment later Racksole himself entered the room. "Going on all right?" he inquired, pointing to the bedroom. "Excellently," the lovers answered together, and they both blushed. "Ah!" said Racksole. "Then, if that's so, and you can spare a minute, I've something to show you, Prince." Chapter 30 Conclusion "I've a great deal to tell you, Prince," Racksole began, as soon as they were out of the room, "and also, as I said, something to show you. Will you come to my room? We will talk there first. The whole hotel is humming with excitement." "With pleasure," said Aribert. "Glad his Highness Prince Eugen is recovering," Racksole said, urged by considerations of politeness. "Ah! As to that," Aribert began. "If you don't mind, we'll discuss that later, Prince," Racksole interrupted him. They were in the proprietor's private room. "I want to tell you all about last night," Racksole resumed, "about my capture of Jules and my examination of him this morning. and he launched into a full account of the whole thing, down to the least details. "You see," he concluded, "that our suspicions as to Bosnia were tolerably correct. But as regards Bosnia, the more I think about it, the surer I feel that nothing can be done to bring their criminal politicians to justice." "And as to Jules, what do you propose to do?" "Come this way," said Racksole, and led Aribert to another room. A sofa in this room was covered with a linen cloth. Racksole lifted the cloth, he could never deny himself a dramatic moment, and disclosed the body of a dead man. It was Jules, dead, but without a scratch or mark on him. "I have sent for the police. Not a street constable, but an official from Scotland Yard," said Racksole. "How did this happen?" Aribert asked, amazed and startled. "I understood you to say that he was safely immured in the bedroom." "So he was," Racksole replied. "I went up there this afternoon, chiefly to take him some food. The commissionaire was on guard at the door. He had heard no noise, nothing unusual. Yet when I entered the room Jules was gone. He had by some means or other loosened his fastenings. He had then managed to take the door off the wardrobe. He had moved the bed in front of the window, and by pushing the wardrobe door 3 parts out of the window, and lodging the inside end of it under the rail at the head of the bed, he had provided himself with a sort of insecure platform outside the window. All this he did without making the least sound. He must then have got through the window and stood on the little platform. With his fingers he would just be able to reach the outer edge of the white cornice under the roof of the hotel. By main strength of arms he had swung himself onto this cornice, and so got on to the roof proper. He would then have the run of the whole roof. At the side of the building facing Salisbury Lane there is an iron fire escape, which runs right down from the ridge of the roof into a little sunk yard level with the cellars. Jules might have thought that his escape was accomplished. But it unfortunately happened that one rung in the iron escape ladder had rusted rotten through being badly painted. It gave way, and Jules, not expecting anything of the kind, fell to the ground. That was the end of all his cleverness and ingenuity. As Racksole ceased speaking, he replaced the linen cloth with a gesture from which reverence was not wholly absent. When the grave had closed over the dark and tempestuous career of Tom Jackson, once the pride of the Grand Babylon, there was little trouble for the people whose adventures we have described. Miss Spencer, that yellow-haired, faithful slave and attendant of a brilliant scoundrel, was never heard of again. Possibly to this day she survives, a mystery to her fellow creatures, in the pension of some cheap foreign boarding-house. As for Rocco, he certainly was heard of again. Several years after the events set down, it came to the knowledge of Felix Babylon that the unrivalled Rocco had reached Buenos Aires, and by his culinary skill was there making the fortune of a new and splendid hotel. Babylon transmitted the information to Theodore Racksole, and Racksole might, had he chosen, have put the forces of the law in motion against him. But Racksole, seeing that everything pointed to the fact that Rocco was now pursuing his vocation honestly, decided to leave him alone. The one difficulty which Racksole experienced after the demise of Jules, and it was a difficulty which he had of course anticipated, was connected with the police. The police, very properly, wanted to know things. They desired to be informed what Racksole had been doing in the Dimmock affair between his first visit to Ostend and his sending for them to take charge of Jules' dead body. And Racksole was by no means inclined to tell them everything. Beyond question he had transgressed the laws of England, and possibly also the laws of Belgium, and the moral excellence of his motives in doing so was, of course, in the eyes of legal justice, no excuse for such conduct. The inquest upon Jules aroused some bother, and about 99 separate and distinct rumours. In the end, however, a compromise was arrived at. Racksole's first aim was to pacify the inspector whose clue, which by the way was a false one, he had so curtly declined to follow up. That done, the rest needed only tact and patience. He proved to the satisfaction of the authorities that he had acted in a perfectly honest spirit, though with a high hand, and that substantial justice had been done. Also, he subtly indicated that, if it came to the point, he should defy them to do their worst. Lastly, he was able, through the medium of the United States ambassador, to bring certain soothing influences to bear upon the situation. One afternoon, a fortnight after the recovery of the hereditary Prince of Posen, Aribert, who was still staying at the Grand Babylon, expressed a wish to hold converse with the millionaire. Prince Eugen, accompanied by Hans and some court officials whom he had sent for, had departed with immense éclat, armed with a comfortable million, to arrange formally for his betrothal. Touching the million, Eugen had given satisfactory personal security, and the money was to be paid off in 15 years. "You wish to talk to me, Prince," said Racksole to Aribert, when they were seated together in the former's room. "I wish to tell you," replied Aribert, "that it is my intention to renounce all my rights and titles as a royal Prince of Posen, and to be known in future as Count Hartz, a rank to which I am entitled through my mother. Also that I have a private income of £10,000 a year, and a chateau and a town house in Posen. I tell you this because I am here to ask the hand of your daughter in marriage. I love her, and I am vain enough to believe that she loves me. I have already asked her to be my wife, and she has consented. We await your approval." "You honour us, Prince," said Racksole with a slight smile, "and in more ways than one. May I ask your reason for renouncing your princely titles?" "Simply because the idea of a morganatic marriage would be as repugnant to me as it would be to yourself and to Nella." "That is good." The Prince laughed. "I suppose it has occurred to you that £10,000 per annum for a man in your position is a somewhat small income. Nella is frightfully extravagant. I have known her to spend $60,000 in a single year, and have nothing to show for it at the end. Why, she would ruin you in 12 months." "Nella must reform her ways," Aribert said. "If she is content to do so," Racksole went on, "well and good. I consent." "In her name and my own, I thank you," said Aribert gravely. "And," the millionaire continued, "so that she may not have to reform too fiercely, I shall settle on her absolutely, with reversion to your children, if you have any, a lump sum of $50 million, that is to say, £10 million, in sound, selected railway stock. I reckon that is about half my fortune. Nella and I have always shared equally." Aribert made no reply. The two men shook hands in silence, and then it happened that Nella entered the room. That night, after dinner, Racksole and his friend Felix Babylon were walking together on the terrace of the Grand Babylon Hotel. Felix had begun the conversation. "I suppose, Racksole," he had said, "you aren't getting tired of the Grand Babylon?" "Why do you ask?" "Because I am getting tired of doing without it. 1,000 times since I sold it to you I have wished I could undo the bargain. I can't bear idleness. Will you sell?" "I might," said Racksole. "I might be induced to sell." "What will you take, my friend?" asked Felix. "What I gave," was the quick answer. "Eh?" Felix exclaimed. "I sell you my hotel with Jules, with Rocco, with Miss Spencer? You go and lose all those 3 inestimable servants, and then offer me the hotel without them at the same price? It is monstrous." The little man laughed heartily at his own wit. "Nevertheless," he added, "we will not quarrel about the price. I accept your terms." And so was brought to a close the complex chain of events which had begun when Theodore Racksole ordered a steak and a bottle of Bass at the table d'hote of the Grand Babylon Hotel. End of chapter 29 and 30. End of the Grand Babylon Hotel by Arnold Bennett. Recorded by Anna Simon. August 2008.